Hello everyone, welcome to What If Luffy ate Hie Hie no Me Part 2. Chapter 7. Luffy groaned as he woke up from a sharp jerk. We must have landed. He concluded, placing his hat atop his head, bringing his sword back down to his hip and standing in the small boat. What island are we at, navigator? He heard Zoro's gruff voice from the shore. I told you, my name is Nami, not navigator. Anyway, this island is called the Gecko Islands. It has a small village called Syrup Village on it. Remember, we're going to get a ship and some supplies, not cause trouble. Nami's reply came. Luffy felt four presences on the cliff ahead of them as he walked onto the shore. He put his hand on his hilt along with Zoro. We're not alone. The green-haired swordsman grunted an affirmative from his left, while Nami looked confused before seeing four people spying on them from the ridge. They're over there, she said, pointing at the top of the hill. Three of the people hiding there screamed out. Ah, they found us. The three kids shouted, seemingly running away. Luffy sensed the children move to some bushes to the right of him and his crew. The last present stood to his full height. He was a tan teenager with a long nose, dark curly hair reaching his shoulders and a bandana around his head. Pirates, leave this village, now. It is under the protection of the Usopp pirates. If you attack this village, you will have to face my fleet of 8,000 men. The teenager, presumably Usopp, spoke out with a tinge of fear in his voice. He can't be serious. Luffy thought, a drop of sweat rolling down the back of his head. The reason being that dozens of pirate flags came out of the bushes at the tree line and only 6 of them started moving up and down. Luffy exhaled a bit and looked over at the bushes the 6 moving flags were at. He pointed and grinned smugly. You mean those 3 brats? The aforementioned children jumped up from their hiding spot and ran for the hills. Usopp looked shocked at his front being seen through. He quickly recovered though. Though it's true I don't have that many people, my skills with a slingshot. He pulled out a green slingshot from his satchel and held it in front of him, ready to use, outmatch anyone's skills with a regular pistol. He said, readying his slingshot to fire. Luffy shadowed his expression with his hat. If you say that, put your life on the line. Usopp looked a bit confused at this, but ready to shot anyway. The straw-hatted captain leveled a serious glare at Usopp. That weapon in your hand isn't a tool for threats, it's a tool for action. As soon as you let that pachinko fly, it's on. He flicked his sword out of its sheath just a bit. Zoro flicked his out as well and smirked. This man before you is a real pirate. Usopp looked terrified at the 3 pirates below him. They weren't even trying to intimidate him. He collapsed to his hands and knees, trembling in fear. Alright, do your worst. Luffy managed to calm down enough to speak a slightly coherent sentence. We're not gonna do anything. I took that line from somebody I idolize and tweaked it a bit. He said. Usopp relaxed a bit at that. Your name is Usopp, right? Luffy asked, getting a nod from the teenager. Do you know a man named Usopp by any chance? Usopp looked shocked by the name Usopp before jumping into gear and rushing down the hill, falling on his face in the process before recovering quickly. He was in Luffy's face and asked hurriedly. How do you know my father, is he alright? Yeah, he is. How about we go to a restaurant and talk about this more? Usopp immediately agreed and started walking to the village he lived in. Zoro, Nami, come on. They just nodded and followed behind Luffy. Short skip. Luffy, Zoro, Nami, and Usopp were sitting in a booth at a restaurant called Meshi, talking about Usopp's father. Your dad is an honorable man, he talked about you so much, I practically know you by now. Luffy said, taking a swig from his sake bottle. My dad is at sea, huh? Usopp spoke proudly. Where is he now? He asked curiously, leaning on the table. I don't know where he is exactly, he could be anywhere from paradise to the new world with Shanks, but I know he's doing fine out there. Luffy said, emptying his bottle and placing it on the table. But Shanks, huh? Usopp said quietly before getting a shocked look on his face. Wait, red-haired Shanks. Luffy nodded, ordering another bottle of sake. One of the Yonko, that red-haired Shanks. Yep, the one and the same. Luffy said, taking a few gulps of his alcohol. Now, do you know where we can get a ship around here? He asked, putting the bottle down on the table. Sorry, but there isn't a place you could get a boat. Usopp said, shaking his head and crossing his arms. You said you were looking for a new crewmate, right? He took up a smug-looking expression. Yeah. Luffy said, raising an eyebrow at the teen's behavior. I'll join you, but only if I can be captain. Usopp said, looking self-prideful. In response, the small crew said, in a deadpan voice. No. Usopp looked taken aback at the non-existent hesitation they took to deny his offer. Anyway, there isn't anywhere to get a ship here, sorry. He said after a few moments. Zoro looked out the window and noticed a large mansion on top of the hill. Then what's that, a summer home? He sarcastically asked, pointing to the mansion. Usopp suddenly slammed his hands on the table and standing up. No. Do not go there. He shouted out before regaining his composure and started sweating nervously. Well, would you look at the time, gotta go. He said, dashing out of the restaurant. Wonder what that was all about. Nami muttered, looking at the door with a curious gaze. Yeah. Luffy agreed before shrugging and ordering more alcohol and food from the waitress, politely of course. The three sat, ate, and drank for a few minutes, then the three kids that were at the shore with Usopp burst in through the front door, screaming out. The Usopp pirates are here. The kids ran up to the table just as Luffy was having some Fetzer Crimson Red Winean. It's real, I did my research. Wanting some variety, and was curious how it tasted. It's pretty good. He thought offhandedly, pouring more for himself from the bottle. The children held their wooden swords in front of them, trying to look threatening. Where is the captain, what did you do to him? They asked, still trying to look threatening. Drinking out of his wine glass, Luffy smirked, a mischievous plan forming in his head. Pretending not to notice the children, he looked at Zoro and spoke. This wine is delicious, you should have some, Zoro. He didn't notice that some of the wine dribbled out from the corner of his mouth, making it look like blood dribbling out. The kids looked frightened at this and started trembling. What did you do to him? The middle one spoke. Luffy gave a maniacal grin and spoke with a dark and evil voice. Your captain? He gave a slight evil chuckle, he looked down at the kids with an insane glint in his eyes. We drained him of his blood. He shouted in their faces, scaring them shitless. They screamed and pointed at the laughing Nami. Ah. Ogress. Nami took exception to that and rounded on them, glaring. Why are you pointing at me? She shouted at them with an angry tick mark pulsing on her head. To discipline the children for their remark, she pounded their heads into the ground while Luffy and Zoro kept laughing at their prank while Nami scolded them for the joke they pulled. Who are you three, anyway? Luffy asked after he and Zoro calmed down enough to speak. The three kids answered individually. I'm Paimon. The child that first spoke had dark green hair shaped like a pepper, a short-sleeved shirt, and blue shorts. I'm Ninjin. This child had short spiky purple hair that covers his eyes, a red hat atop his head with a tuft on top, making his head resemble a carrot, and he was wearing a black hoodie and light orange pants. And I'm Tamanegi. The final child spoke, he had straight light orange hair with a tuft on top, making his head look like an onion. He wore square glasses on his face, a yellow shirt with a blue vest jacket over it, a pair of brown shorts with a dark yellow sash around the waist. Okay, well, I'm Luffy, the Straw Hat teen pointed to himself, that's Zoro, he pointed over to his first mate, and this is Nami, he pointed to his navigator, it's nice to meet you three. If you're looking for Usopp, we don't know where he is, he just dashed out after we mentioned that mansion up there. Realization dawned on the children's faces, and Paimon spoke up. He went up there to talk to the Oju-sama that lives there. He goes up there all the time to tell lies to her. Luffy choked on his wine a bit at hearing that. Why would he do that? He was very confused at why the children would be so proud of their captain lying to a girl's face. He tells her fake stories that make her feel better. You see, the Oju-sama is sick and Usopp goes over there to make her feel better by telling fake stories that make her happy. Paimon explained. Luffy stood silent for a few seconds, pondering what to do when he stood up. Alright, come on guys, we know where to get a ship and I won't feel like an asshole trying to get one. He walked out of the restaurant with the kids and his crew following him. Nami was muttering something about not cursing around kids. Short skip. Luffy, Zoro, Nami, Paimon, Ninjin, and Tamanegi were standing near the mansion, trying to find a way in. Luffy wanted to knock the guards out quickly, but Nami said no. Just let me do it, it'll be quick and painless. Luffy tried to compromise again with knocking the guards out, which got him Nami's fist crashing on his head. He then felt a familiar presence on the other side of the fence, along with a second unknown one. He put his hand up in a shut the fuck up fashion. Usopp's on the other side of this fence. He said. So? What's that got to do with it? Nami asked a little grumpily. Just grab on, I'll do the rest. Luffy said, turning to the gate. Nami and Zoro hesitated, remembering last time, but did so anyway, while the children grabbed on without hesitation. Gecko. Luffy said, jumping up and 15 meters above the fence. Shit, messed up. Luffy thought, berating himself for his mistake. Nobody let go. I've got this. He said, feeling their grips tighten around him at his words. The 6 people fell to the ground at an alarming rate and when they were about to hit the ground, Luffy kicked the air again to slow their descent down enough to not get hurt. When he landed, everyone let go of him and collapsed, taking in large gulps of air. Who are you people? He heard a curious voice come from above him. He looked up and saw a frail blonde woman looking at him with her head tilted to the right a bit in a curious motion. Usopp looked to panic a bit before responding as if on instinct. They're here to join my crew, obviously. Luffy just ignored him and jumped onto the tree branch Usopp was on, landing next to him. I was actually wondering if you could do us a favor, Oju-sama. He said politely, remembering the manners beaten into him by Shanks. The favor? The young woman asked, tilting her head again to the side in curiosity. Yes, a favor. I was wondering if you could sup. He was about to request for a ship when he was rudely interrupted by somebody. What in the hell is going here? An angry voice sounded out. Everybody looked over and saw a lanky man with dark, slicked back hair, slim glasses, a pinstripe suit with matching dress pants and striped dress shoes. "Oh, Clahitter, these are the blonde girl," was just about to tell Clahitter who the people were, but was interrupted by aforementioned butler. "No need to explain, Kaya Oju-sama, I'll deal with this riffraff before long," Clahitter said somewhat rudely and ordered the people before him. "Now, I believe it is time for you people to leave," he said, pushing his glasses up with the heel of his hand. Before anyone could say or do anything, Luffy spoke out. "As far as I'm concerned, Miss Kaya, was it?" He got a nod of approval from Kaya. "Miss Kaya, here, owns this house and property, so we are staying until she says otherwise," Luffy said calmly, angering the butler. Seeing no progression with Luffy, Clahitter switched to target Usopp. "Oh, it's you, Usopp. I have heard your name a lot throughout the village." Usopp rubbed his nose proudly. "Of course the whole village knows me, they love me. Usopp the liar, Usopp the thief, Usopp the scoundrel. Must I go on?" Clahitter sounded condescending towards Usopp. "I do believe it is because of your worthless father." Usopp flinched at the butler's remark. "What did you say about my father?" he growled out, glaring harshly at the butler. "Clahitter, apologize, that was rude." Kaya scolded, frowning at her butler's choice of words against Usopp. "I'm only speaking the truth, this is best for you, Oju-sama." Instead of sounding caring like his words insinuated, his voice was highly condescending, and he had a smirk on his face. It makes sense that Usopp would act like he does and get a bad reputation in town. His father is a scumbag pirate that knocked up some whore on the island. Clahitter continued on with his verbal onslaught against Usopp. "Clahitter, you have gone too far. Apologize to Usopp right now." Kaya screamed out, angry at Clahitter's attitude toward Usopp. "I have nothing to apologize for, Oju-sama. It is the truth after all, Usopp is just the accidental child from an unruly family," the butler said, still with the annoying smirk on his face. This seemed to enrage Usopp as he dropped down from his place in the tree and dashed to the butler, grabbing him by his collar and getting in his face. "Don't you dare badmouth my family, you bastard," he growled out, eyes swimming with rage. "Why would you want to defend your family? Your father's just a piece of worthless pirate scum and your mother allowed herself to get knocked up by a criminal." Clahitter mocked with cruel enjoyment. This seemed enough to break Usopp. He pulled his fist back and threw it forward, hitting the butler in his face as hard as he can, shouting out in a rage. "Shut up." The butler fell back and hit the ground, blood on his lip. He slowly sat up, wiping the blood from his lip, chuckling a mirthless laugh. Jumping right to violence, huh? Like father, like son. Usopp was about to rush forward and hit the butler again. But stopped at Kaya's voice. "Usopp, please stop," she said, lip trembling. "Yes, stop and leave this area immediately, same with the rest of you," Clahitter ordered. This angered the children and they didn't bother to hide it. "Jerk. Idiot. Meanie." The children were immediately reprimanded by Nami and told to leave with her and Zoro. "Fine, I'll leave and never come back," Usopp said, storming out of the. Luffy frowned at Usopp taking Clahitter's words without a fight. Luffy just sighed and dropped down from the branch. "Alright, come on guys, let's find Usopp and have a talk with him." The three kids, Zoro and Nami obliged and followed him out. They soon saw Usopp walking down the street, grumbling obscenities under his breath. Luffy put his hand on Usopp's shoulder, making him jump in shock. He whipped around and calmed down at the sight of everybody. "Hey guys, what's up?" he asked casually. Luffy pulled his hand off of the liar's shoulder and sat down on the fence that was near the path they were on. "I was actually thinking about extending an invitation to you about joining my crew, Usopp," Luffy said with a grin, looking Usopp dead in the eye. Usopp looked shocked for a quick second before he narrowed his eyes at Luffy. "No, I won't, I can't," he said defiantly, shocking Luffy and the rest with a slight hostility in his voice. Just as Luffy was going to ask again, Usopp threw down a smoke pellet and when the smoke cleared, he was gone. "He can run pretty fast," Zoro said blandly. Luffy hopped off of the fence and turned to the kids. "Do you three have any idea where he could have gone?" The three seemed to think for a bit before answering. "There is one place," Ninjin said. "Yeah, the coast," Tamanegi quipped. "He always goes there to think," Paimon said. "It's in that direction," they all said, pointing southward. Luffy nodded and started walking off. "I'll go talk to Usopp, you guys wait over here," he said, waving back at them. "What the hell are we supposed to do?" Nami shouted at Luffy, a tick mark pulsing on her head. "Your nakama, bond a bit," Luffy called out carelessly, still walking off. Zoro and Nami stared at each other for a second before speaking. "Asshole. Bitch. There, bonded." At the coast, Usopp was sitting at his thinking spot on the coast when he's startled by Luffy's voice coming from behind him. "The view here is great, no wonder you come here to think," he said, sitting next to Usopp. He was silent for a few moments before he spoke up again. Is there any particular reason you don't want to leave? Usopp was silent for a few moments before speaking up again. There are a couple of reasons. One of them is the village, I've made too many happy memories here to just up and leave. The second is Usopp trailed off at this point, but Luffy had a pretty good guess at what the reason was. It's your girlfriend, isn't it? He said, almost teasingly. Usopp flared up like a radioactive tomato. She's not my girlfriend. He shouted defensively, though his red face wasn't helping much. Whatever, you ever gonna talk to Kaya again? Luffy asked Usopp with a quirked brow. This turned Usopp's mood sour. Not until that damn butler apologizes to me for badmouthing my father. He grumbled, an angry frown on his face. Luffy looked down and saw the butler standing across from a strange-looking man. You want to talk to the butler, he's right down there. He said, pointing at the coast. What the why is he all the way out here? Usopp exclaimed, muttering the last part. Let's listen in, this doesn't seem normal for someone like that butler. Luffy said, laying on the ground and pulling Usopp down with him. Django, I told you to not draw any attention towards yourself, but I heard talk of people seeing a strange man sleeping in the middle of the street. Clahatter told Django. Django just put his hand on his hat. I didn't draw any attention to myself, and I am not weird. He complained slightly. Sure looks weird to me. Luffy thought, sweat rolling down the back of his head. Whatever, how is the progress with the plan to murder the young mistress, Kaya, Captain Kuro? Django asked the butler across from him. Kuro. Wait, isn't he supposed to be dead? Usopp muttered to himself under his breath. I told you not to call me by that name anymore, Django. You're captain now, unless you've forgotten, and don't use murder, that's too crude. Kuro warned, pushing his glasses up by the heel of his hand. Oh, yes, I meant accident of course. Django said, putting his hand up to his mouth. Is the crew ready for tomorrow, Django? Kuro asked, pushing his glasses up again. Yes, of course, though they're a bit anxious, Captain. Django told Kuro. Let's go over the plan again to make sure you remember. Kuro said, pushing his glasses up again. Okay then, Django cleared his throat a bit as he explained the plan to his captain. Me and the crew will attack the village at dawn, causing major damage. I will then proceed to go into the Oju-sama's mansion and hypnotize her to ride her will so that she would give everything to you after her accident. Django said. Remember, you have to hypnotize her to ride her riches and property over to Clahatter, not Kuro, and make sure to make her death look like an accident. The fake butler reminded. Of course. Django waved off his worries. Luffy and Usopp silently slipped away from the cliff and walked to a small clearing where Usopp started freaking out when he fully computed the situation. They're gonna kill Kaya and destroy the village, what should I do? Usopp muttered frantically to himself as he paced to and fro. Usopp, calm down and think things through, alright. Luffy said to Usopp, trying to get him to calm down, but it didn't work. I'm going to warn them, I've got to, especially Kaya. Usopp said with hardened resolve and dashed off before Luffy could stop him. Luffy cursed silently to himself and walked off, looking for Zoro and Nami to tell them about Kuro. He spread out his haki and found them not in the same area, but in a clearing near the path they were on earlier with the three children. Without another thought, he dashed his way over to the clearing, arriving in front of them and scaring the living shit out of the kids and startling Zoro and Nami. Hey guys. He said without a single care in the world. Nami hit him on the head. Don't do that again, you scared me. She shouted, a tick mark on her head. Whatever, there are more pressing matters ahead of us. Luffy said in a serious voice, gathering attention immediately. Well, what is it? Zoro asked from his position against the trunk of the tree he was resting on. Clahatter is actually a pirate, Kuro of 1,000 plans, to be exact, and is wanting to attack the village tomorrow at dawn. Luffy bluntly stated, sitting down and crossing his legs. Everyone stared at him shocked before Nami noticed an absence. Where's Usopp, wasn't he with you? He ran off to tell the village before I could stop him. Luffy said, slightly irked at Usopp's inability to keep his panic down. Right now, though, we can only wait for Usopp to show up again to see what we'll do, seeing as the invasion is in half a day. Everyone agreed with that statement and started to wait for the long-nosed liar, so they all slept, all except for Luffy. Few hours later, 9 hours until invasion. Luffy and the others were walking to the village when they saw Usopp walking down a path clutching his left arm with his head down. Hey Usopp. Luffy called out. Usopp seemed startled to being called out to so suddenly. He moved an armband he had over a wound near his shoulder and turned around with a fake smile on his face. Hey guys, what's going on? He greeted cheerfully. Before Luffy could speak, the children spoke out. Captain, we heard about Kuro attacking the village tomorrow, let us help you. Usopp shadowed his face so that no one could see it before he snapped his head and let out a boisterous fake laugh. Ha 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 ha. I sure fooled you guys, I lied about that to get back at the butler. The kids looked shocked for a second before their faces dropped. You really got us, Captain. Tamanegi said, slightly impressed. Yeah, you sure did. Paimon said emotionlessly. I know you didn't like the butler, but that was too much. Ninjin said, disappointed with Usopp's lie. I'm disappointed in you, Captain. Hyman agreed. Yeah, that was low, Captain. Tamanegi put in his own 2 cents. But those final words, the 3 kids left while the 3 pirates kept their eyes on Usopp, who sighed sadly after the kids left. You lied to keep the kids out of it, didn't you? Zoro stated more than asked. Usopp sat down against the fence on the side of the trail, sighing. I had to, they'd die otherwise. He said, covering his face with his hand. Nami took notice of his bleeding arm and rushed over. Why is your arm bleeding? Without waiting for an answer, she pulled the armband back and saw a bullet wound on his arm. I got shot when I tried to warn Kaya. Usopp explained before he was roughly dragged to his home, which he explained where it was, and got it stitched, cleaned, and bandaged by Nami. I tried to warn everybody, but they didn't believe a single word I said. Usopp said miserably, but then continued on with determination. But, I'll still protect this village until my last dying breath. Luffy looked pensive before he looked up and straight at Usopp. Alright, we'll help you. Luffy said with a smirk, shocking Usopp. What? Why? Usopp questioned. For one, you're hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. Zoro blandly stated. I'm not going to let you die. Luffy said with a grin on his face. And you have fear all over your face. Nami said with a slight smirk. At the last statement, Usopp jumped up and thumped his chest, exclaiming that he wasn't scared of a bunch of pirates, which was all ruined by his shaking legs, which he tried to get under control before falling on his knees. Fine, I'm scared, but who wouldn't be, it's a whole crew. I know I can't handle a whole crew, but I'll do it for my village. Usopp shouted out with confidence. That's why I said we'll help. Luffy said with his grin. Nami was silent for a few moments before she sighed and put a smile on her face. Fine, but I get first dibs on their treasure. Zoro smirked and flicked one of his swords out a bit. I've been itching for a fight, anyway. Usopp's confidence suddenly increased tenfold. Alright, I've got an idea, but what are you guys best at? He asked the 3. I freeze people and kick ass. Luffy said, punching his open palm. I cut. Zoro blandly said. I steal. Nami said with a smirk on her face. And I hide. Usopp said flatly, earning him a smack upside the head from Luffy, Nami, and Zoro. Not this time, you're not. They shouted at the same time. Alright. Usopp whined, nursing the bump on his head. Whatever, it's time to get my plan underway. Everyone yawned at that, though. We should probably get some sleep though. Luffy said, leaning against the wall and falling asleep. Everybody else agreed and found a comfortable enough spot and fell asleep. Dawn invasion commencing. This is a risky plan, you know that right? Zoro asked his captain, who was standing next to him at the southern slope of the island that was covered in oil. Yeah, I still don't feel comfortable about leaving those 2 alone. I'm not saying they're weak, but Nami isn't much of a fighter and Usopp seems more like a distance fighter, which puts them at a disadvantage against a large horde of charging, bloodthirsty pirates. Luffy explained with a thoughtful look on his face. You thinking about training them in Haki? Luffy nodded in response. Yeah, it'll have to wait until we get a bigger ship, though, the training sessions for Haki take up quite some space. He said, noticing the sun starting to peak above the horizon. The pirates should be attacking soon. Luffy and Zoro waited on top of the slope for 5 minutes before Luffy felt presences on the northern side of the island. Don't tell me. Luffy thought, looking in the direction of the northern slope. Shit. They're attacking the northern side, Zoro, come on. Luffy got an exclamation of approval from Zoro as they started running north. However, Luffy noticed Zoro was starting to veer off to the left, so he reached out and snatched him up. What the hell are you doing? Zoro shouted at Luffy with an angry shark tooth expression. You were going the wrong way, so we're going to take the express ticket. Luffy said with a glint in his eye and paired with Luffy's famous grin, Zoro didn't like it one bit. Zoro. Luffy dashed ahead still carrying Zoro, who felt as if all of the air was sucked out of his lungs in a split second. Although it was a short trip, it felt like eons to Zoro. When they stopped, Luffy dropped him on the ground. The green-haired swordsman was about to snap at his captain, but heard sounds of battle just outside of the forest they were in. On a silent countdown, Zoro and Luffy dashed out and cleared out all of the pirates with one of their own techniques, launching the enemies down to the bottom of the slope. What? You're that strong? Usopp's voice shouted out in shock. Of course, I gotta be to be the pirate king. Luffy said with his grin on his face, shocking Usopp with his proclamation. What? Pirate king, you really must be crazy. Usopp said, muttering the last part and scratching his head. Luffy looked to the bottom of the slope and saw the pirates surrounding Django. That weird guy is doing something over there. He said, pointing at the pirates. He's a hypnotist, don't let him do anything. Nami said cautiously. When I say 1, 2, Django, you will all be super strong, your wounds will heal, and you feel no fear. Django said, swinging his pendulum blade in front of the crew. 1, 2 Django. There's no way that's going to work. Nami said, unconvinced by the trick. Suddenly, the pirates started roaring in bestial rage, their muscles bulging, eyes rolled up into their heads. One of them ran to the cliff nearby and smashed it with his fists, knocking a huge section off. Nami and Usopp were hugging each other, screaming in fear, while Luffy raised an eyebrow and Zoro put his guard up. The pirates started a mad dash up the slope at the fore. Luffy sighed and walked forward. "Zoro, I'll take care of them, you hang back," he said, lowering his hat to guard his eyes. Zoro looked like he wanted to argue, but relented and let Luffy do what he wanted. Luffy stopped halfway down the slope, still looking down. He brought his head up and glared at the incoming pirates, letting out a wave of Hashoku Haki, knocking them out. The pirates collapsed unconscious, foaming at the mouths, leaving only Django conscious but scared shitless. "It's not over, we still have those two," Django muttered to himself before calling up to the ship. "Bucci. Sham. Come down here, we need you." A few moments after Django shouted up to the ship, two figures jumped from the Black Cat pirate's ship and landed, cratering the ground. "Yes, Captain, what do you need us to do?" The figure that spoke was a skinny man who was dressed like a cat. He had on cat ears, a pair of gloves with short cat claws on the fingertips. "Yeah, Captain, what do you need us for?" The other figure looked like the scrawny one, but really round and fat. Luffy shortly wondered if he could roll the fat one like a ball. "I need you two to defeat those four," Django commanded, pointing to Luffy, Zoro, Nami and Usopp. "But mainly, that one." Django pointed to Luffy. What, we can't do that, he looks too strong, Captain." The skinny one stuttered out. Why yeah, we only watch the ship, we're not supposed to fight." The fat one said fearfully. "Whatever, now Sham, go." Django commanded the skinny one. Sham jumped from being called. "Why me? Just go." Django shouted. Sham complied, albeit very hesitantly. Alright then, get ready, I'm gonna slice you into ribbons." He stuttered out, swiping in front of him with his cat glove. Luffy was a bit skeptical at the scene and raised an eyebrow. "You sure you want to do this? You'll get hurt badly if you do." Sham suddenly grinned wickedly and lunged at Luffy full speed, swiping his claws down at him. Luffy reached for his sword, but found that it wasn't there. He looked up and saw that Bucci had his sword, he couldn't block the swipe and had to take it head on. Sham slashed Luffy across the chest, leaving 4 jagged deep claw marks going from shoulder to hip. Usopp was shocked by the scene, not knowing of Luffy's abilities. Zoro and Nami looked a bit worriedly at the scene, but noticed no blood from the cuts and relaxed. Looks like his sword is all ours, Sham," Bucci said cruelly, holding Luffy's sword in his paws like it was a prize. This angered Zoro, but he stood firm, knowing it was still Luffy's fight. "You know, I'm offended," Luffy said, standing up, his wound closing up. "It's not nice to treat somebody's sword as a trophy. Just because I'm down doesn't mean I'm dead, and finally, I'm not defenseless without my sword." "What the how are you still alive?" Sham shouted, surprised at the turn of events. "Now then," Luffy started, going down into a battle stance, "let's get started, shall we?" Luffy smirked before disappearing and reappearing near Sham. "Use a shoku." He infused Haki into his right elbow, turning it a sleek metallic black, and drove it into Sham's ribs, making him cough up blood and launching him into the cliff wall. Usopp was amazed by Luffy's speed and strength. "Wait, why isn't he bleeding?" he questioned Nami, who stood next to him. "We'll explain later, anyway I'm going to go plunder their ship." Nami dismissed the issue and ran towards the ship and nearly got hit with the flying body of Bucci. She looked over at Luffy and saw him adjusting his sword onto his hip without a care in the world. This seemed to have pissed Nami off because she snapped at Luffy about being careful where he sent his enemies flying with a shark tooth expression. Luffy, though, just waved her off. "Just go plunder that ship, that's what you were going to do anyway," he said, pointing to the pirate ship. Nami didn't waste any time and rushed towards the ship, jumped aboard, and started her quest for loot. Luffy turned to Django and saw that he was frozen in place and sweating bullets, but he could tell it wasn't because of him. "CCC Captain Kuro." Django shouted out in fear and surprise, looking to the top of the slope. "It is past dawn, why hasn't the plan gone underway as I have ordered?" Kuro shouted out. He had a small duffel bag in his left hand while his right hand pushed his glasses up. Well, it's these kids, Captain. They're causing trouble." Django stuttered out. He shut his mouth though when Kuro's glare hardened. "I can see the crew is starting to wake up, tell them they have 5 minutes to kill these kids, or I'll kill all of you here right now," Kuro said coldly, the statement causing all of the pirates to go wide-eyed and snap awake in fear. Django clicked his tongue in slight annoyance and called the crew over. Luffy and Zoro didn't do anything to stop it. "Eyes, why aren't you stopping them?" Usopp called out in confusion and fear. "We might be able to have some more fun." Luffy reasoned with a smirk and Zoro wholeheartedly agreed. "When I say 1, 2, Django, you will all become exponentially stronger, have absolutely no fear, and all of your wounds will heal." Django started swinging his pendulum blade in front of the crew. 1, 2, Django. Just like before, the pirates roared with bestial rage, their eyes rolled into their heads, and their muscles bulged, but it seemed to be intensified tenfold. Zoro. Luffy called out, drawing his sword and walking to stand next to Zoro, who drew his 3 and tied his bandana around his head. Yeah, this is gonna be fun. Zoro said with a wolfish smirk, tightening his bandana around his head. Luffy gave his own wolfish grin. Damn straight it will be. He and Zoro started to run at the hypnotized pirates who charged straight back at them. Santoryu. Tatsumaki. Zoro shouted out, creating a whirlwind by spinning rapidly, slashing his 3 swords. The pirates were thrown in all directions with dozens of minor, but fatal, slashes on their bodies from Zoro's attack. Fubuki Ham. Luffy shouted, slicing the air in front of him, sending a long pale blue wind blade at the hypnotized pirates. The ones in front took the most damage from the wind blade, with deep slashes on their chests, blood spraying out of their wounds in a small fountain. The pirates behind were only knocked out or barely conscious from the aftershock of the attack that made their skeletal frames shake and rattle. The large crew fell to the ground, all either unconscious, dead, or just conscious enough to register things around them. By this time, Kuro was furious, his face darkened with pure rage. It seems that not even giving you a fighting chance would let you live, I guess I'll just kill the rest of you. Kuro coldly said, putting his cat gloves on that were in his duffel bag. Clatter. Stop. A feminine voice shouted out. Everyone looked over and saw Kaya standing in front of the forest line. She looked more pale than when Luffy and his crew had met her, she also had slightly flushed cheeks and was panting heavily. The THREE Luffy, Zoro, Usopp were extremely surprised to see Kaya there. Kaya, what are you doing here? Usopp shouted out at her from behind the butler. She ignored Usopp, though. Clatter, if what you want is my fortune, then I'll give it to you, just please leave this village alone. Kaya said determinedly. No, Kaya, he won't listen. Get out of here. Usopp yelled in a panic, trying to get Kaya to listen to reason. You don't seem to understand, Oju-sama, Kuro said with his plain voice. I don't only want your fortune, I want your fortune and a peaceful life that has nothing to do with the sea. He said, turning his cold gaze over to her. Kaya then pulled out a pistol and aimed at Kuro with shaky hands. Clatter, stop this now. She shakily shouted out. Kuro put on a dark smirk and spoke with a mocking tone as he brought back memories of him taking care of her and going out to the village with her over the course of 3 years, making Kaya tremble with and drop the flintlock pistol she was holding as she fell on her knees, sobs racking her body. Luffy narrowed his eyes into a glare at the butler. I hate this guy even more. He thought bitterly, seeing how Kuro manipulated Kaya's feelings. Zoro side-eyed his captain and stepped away a bit, knowing this was going to get ugly, fast. Kuro? Usopp shouted in a rage, holding up his slingshot that already had a lead pachinko ready to fly. Oh, Usopp-kun, I didn't notice you there. Kuro said carelessly. This enraged Usopp more as he let the lead pachinko fly straight at Kuro. Without much effort, Kuro disappeared and reappeared behind Usopp with his claws touching the young lad's face. Usopp was trembling in fear and sweating bullets. That punch you gave me hurt quite a bit and I don't like being hit. Kuro said mockingly. Luffy's eyes gained a dangerous glint to them as he watched the scene before smirking. Zoro. Luffy disappeared from his spot near Zoro and reappeared behind Kuro and backhanding him to the treeline. If you hate getting hit so much, you're gonna hate fighting me. Luffy said, grinning widely. Why you? How did you get here? Usopp stuttered in shock, wondering how he suddenly appeared behind him. Luffy just ignored Usopp as he cracked his knuckles with a smirk on his face. Luffy's expression changed to shock and surprise along with everyone else's when the 3 children jumped out of the forest and started beating Kuro with miscellaneous objects. The children shouted insults and threats at the pirate captain as they hit him with their weapons. The 3 little ones stopped beating up the pirate and turned to Usopp panting. We did it, Captain. Tamanegi shouted proudly, holding up his shovel. Yeah, we beat that butler. Paimon exclaimed with a large grin. Because we're the Usopp pirates. Ninjin shouted out, thumping his chest. The kids seemed to want to impress Usopp, but it didn't work, seeing as Usopp looked horrified at what the kids did. You 3 need to get out of here, now. He shouted at them, ending their celebrating. Usopp noticed that Kuro stood up fixing his glasses with a murderous look in his eyes. Usopp saw this and knelt down. You guys can't stay here, so I'm giving you the most important job. I need you 3 to run into the forest and keep Kaya safe, understand? Usopp told the children. Cap Paimon started but was interrupted by Usopp. Do you understand? He exclaimed more forcefully. The kids all got resolute expressions and nodded in determination as they ran to Kaya and pulled her into the forest. Django, go after the girl. Kuro ordered his hypnotist. Yes, Captain. Django said, running to the forest. Also, take care of the little ones, they're annoying. Kuro said coldly. Django nodded in affirmative and disappeared into the forest. Zoro, Usopp, go with them, I'll take care of this butler. Luffy ordered, turning to Kuro with a smirk on his face. Usopp didn't hesitate and ran into the forest, Zoro hot on his trail. Kuro saw this and tried to cut them off, but stopped due to a massive windblade that sailed along the ground, cutting his path off. He turned and glared at Luffy, whose sword pointing at him. "Their business is with me, Kuro," Luffy said with a grin. "What is your reason for helping Usopp?" Kuro questioned, pushing his glasses up with the heel of his hand. "I don't want him to die," Luffy simply stated, pulling his sword back for a thrust. "Yubukij Dan," he shouted, thrusting his sword forward and sending out a pale blue windbolt, AN. Think like Ryuma's thrust, but only pale blue and not as strong, but still pretty strong. Kuro looked shocked for a second before he vanished and reappeared behind Luffy and raised his claws ready to strike Luffy. "That's a ridiculous reason to help someone," he said as he brought his claws down on Luffy. Luffy quickly brought his sword around and blocked Kuro's claws easily, sparks flying from the point of contact. "That's what you think," he said, swinging his fist at Kuro, who dodged by vanishing again. Kuro reappeared at the bottom of the slope in front of his former crew, who was now fully awake. Kuro looked at his crew as if they were trash. "I still haven't gotten to killing you yet, have I?" This caused the still conscious pirates to reel back in fear and shock. "CC Captain Kuro?" One of them, who were still standing, questioned apprehensively. Kuro's face seemed to darken immediately as he disappeared again and reappeared behind the one that spoke and slashed across his back, causing his body to fall to the ground in multiple pieces, with blood pooling below his cold lifeless corpse. Luffy's eyes widened in outrage and shock as Kuro killed one of his crewmates. Luffy saw Kuro going for another and disappeared. He reappeared in between Kuro and his next victim as his claws were blocked by Luffy, letting sparks fly. The lucky crew member fell back in shock at what happened. Kuro raised an inquisitive eyebrow, still holding his cat claws against Luffy's sword. "Why did you protect him, boy?" Luffy's expression was shadowed by his hat and spoke quietly, but the entire crew still heard what he said. "You treat your crew like disposable toys, Kuro." He spat out Kuro's name like a sour lemon. "They are only mere pawns in my plan for an everlasting peaceful life that has nothing to do with the sea," Kuro said, jumping back from Luffy to get some space. "You became a pirate without real conviction. God, you're such an idiot," Luffy said mockingly. "What did you say, brat?" Kuro all but growled out in a rage. "When you become a pirate, that's the moment you devote yourself to piracy. But to give up not even halfway through, now that's either cowardice or foolishness," Luffy said in a matter-of-fact tone. Kuro's eyes darkened in rage and then let his upper body dangle limply and sway from left to right as he took slow steps forward. "No, Captain, don't use that," one of the pirates shouted in fear. "But so bad, he's just swaying," Luffy thought to himself as he cocked an eyebrow in questioning. "Shikushi." Kuro disappeared after a few tense moments as the pirates were all now trembling in utter fear. "Ah!" One of the pirates screamed out in pain as he got slashed across the chest by Kuro. This caused the pirates to tremble in fear even more as they sweat, and some looked close to insanity. Luffy's rage and hatred at the butler came back in full force as he could sense some of the attacked pirates die instantly. "What the hell do you take your men for, you son of a bitch?" he shouted in a rage. He suddenly felt an attack coming and put up his Loja defenses to take the attack. Two large gashes appeared on Luffy's leg but closed up as soon as they appeared. 2 dead, 3 dead, 4 dead. Luffy unconsciously counted out as he felt the pirates behind him get slaughtered. Having enough of what Kuro was doing, he dropped down into a handstand and quickly swung his legs around in a circle. "Renkyaku. Zennen," he shouted out, sending out a ring airblade all around him. The blade crashed into the cliff walls and slope, kicking up large clouds of dust. Kuro got smashed into the wall by the airblade, cracking some of his ribs and making him cough up blood. Luffy smirked and dashed at Kuro, brought his leg up, brought it back down onto Kuro's cat claws on his right hand, breaking them off at the fingertips. "What?" He broke Kuro's claws. One of the still unharmed pirates shouted out in shock. Without wasting any time, Kuro jumped back on his feet and started his technique again. "Shikushi." He disappeared and random slash marks appeared on the rock faces and more of the pirates, making them scream in pain as blood sprayed out in fountains from their wounds. Luffy narrowed his eyes at the display. "Sorrow." He disappeared and reappeared a moment later holding Kuro up by his throat. Luffy's expression was shadowed by his hat as he didn't flinch at Kuro's attempts of clawing his arm off. "I do believe I've had enough of this, Kuro," Luffy said in a cold voice as he tightened his grip on Kuro's neck. The butler pirate struggled even more and started thrashing in Luffy's grip as his attempts at slicing the straw-hatted man's arm off. "I'd kill you right here, but that would be too traumatizing to 3 people here," Luffy said still with his cold tone of voice. He sensed Usopp, Kaya and Nami watching ever since he broke Kuro's claws. "So, instead, I'm just going to beat you near death," Luffy said with an evil smirk on his face. Luffy threw Kuro into the cliff wall at breakneck speeds, kicking up a dust cloud. Luffy jumped into the air and pointed his arms where he sensed Kuro. He froze the moisture in the air into dozens of ice arrows. Hie Hie. He launched 3 arrows down at Kuro, which he barely managed to dodge by dashing to a different position. Luffy continued to track him though, using observation Haki and continued launching the arrows at Kuro. The last arrow pierced Kuro's leg and pinned him to the cliff wall, making him scream in agony and nearly pass out from the pain. Luffy wasn't finished though as he drew his katana and drew it back, ready to thrust. He thrust the sword forward, shouting out. Fubuki Dan. But he stopped short as Kaya stepped in front of Kuro. What are you doing? You could have been killed. Luffy shouted out, angry at Kaya for doing something so foolish. Luffy's eyes widened slightly as Kaya glared defiantly into his eyes. Even though he caused so much, I can't just let you do this to him. Kaya shouted out with the utmost conviction in her voice. Luffy sighed and sheathed his sword, causing Kaya to relax. Fine, I won't beat him half to death. Luffy said in resignation. That doesn't mean he won't be hurt though. Luffy disappeared and reappeared in front of Kuro. Yuzushoku. He muttered, causing his fist to turn a dark shade of metallic black. Luffy launched his fist into Kuro's gut, causing him to cough out blood and lose consciousness. Luffy unfroze the arrow in his leg, causing it to turn back into water vapor. He's still alive, so take your living back and don't bother the village again. Luffy shouted, tossing the unconscious body of Kuro at the pirates. Needless to say, the pirates didn't waste a second gathering the bodies of Kuro and the Nyaban brothers and sailing back out to sea. Everyone good? Luffy asked, looking around at his crew, Usopp and Kaya. Tired, but fine. Zoro said, yawning and stretching his arms. Yep. Nami said with a smile on her face as she hugged the bag of treasure she got from looting the pirate ship. Yeah. Kaya and Usopp said in unison, though Kaya looked a little flushed and tired. Okay then, that's good. Let's get back to the village, get supplies, and rest up, I'm a bit tired myself. Luffy said, already making his way into the village with everyone following him and Kaya leaning Usopp for support, causing the long-nosed liar to blush. The next day, Luffy and his crew were sitting at a table in the restaurant talking over their next course of action. Looks like we didn't get a ship, I guess we'll have to go to another island, then. Luffy said, taking a sip from his wine glass. He was slightly disappointed that he couldn't get a ship on the island, but excited at the same time for the next adventure. There you are, I've been looking for you guys for a while now. Luffy and company turned to the voice that came from the door and saw Kaya in her regular gown with a brown coat that was unzipped over it. She looked a lot more healthy compared to when they first met her, which was a plus. Kaya, what are you doing here? Luffy questioned, putting his wine glass down and standing from his seat. I wanted to gift you all for helping Usopp protect the village. Kaya said with a smile on her face. Gift us? Zoro asked, raising an eyebrow. Is it money? Nami excitedly asked, clasping her hands together while her eyes were replaced with beely signs and had an overly cheerful smile on her face. Come with me down to the coast and you'll see. Kaya said with a small wink of her eye. Alright, come on guys. Luffy said, taking the wine bottle with him and tossing some of his money at the yelling bartender. Nami and Zoro shrugged and followed after. Scene skip, is this really ours now? Luffy asked hopefully, looking at the caravel before him. Indeed it is, it's called the Going Merry, I designed it myself when I was a young lad. Merry, Kaya's butler, said with a proud smile on his face. Merry walked up to Luffy who was admiring the ship with a grin on his face. If I could have a moment of your time, I'd like to show you how to steer the ship and control it. Luffy looked a little surprised at Merry. You should tell Nami, she's the navigator, and she could tell me later, anyway. Luffy said with a grin on his face. Merry nodded and walked over to Nami and began explaining how the ship worked. Ah. Somebody stop me. Everybody present heard a loud shout coming from the slope and saw a big rolling green ball heading straight for the ship. Zoro, we gotta stop that thing, it's on a crash course with our ship. Luffy ordered, running to the ball with Zoro to stop it. They put their feet up and stopped it, only to find out that Usopp was strapped to it and that their feet were on his face. Thanks, guys. He muttered from underneath their feet. No problem. They said nonchalantly, dropping their feet and letting Usopp get his balance back. A few minutes later, Usopp took off the giant ball, which was his backpack, and put it next to his dinghy. He looked up at Luffy and Zoro with a smile on his face. Looks like this is where we say goodbye, see you guys on the sea someday. Usopp said with a grin on his face. Hey, what the hell are you talking about? Luffy asked rudely with a slight frown on his face. What are you talking about, we are going to see each other out there, right? Usopp asked with a raised eyebrow and a confused frown on his face. Just quit your babbling and get on, you're practically part of my crew already. Luffy said leaning on the railing. Usopp's eyes widened in surprise for a second before he broke out in a huge grin and started dancing a happy dance, and Luffy thought he heard him singing a bit under his breath. Usopp's dance was cut short when he heard Kaya spoke out. "I do hope you keep yourself safe and strong, Usopp-kun," she said with a smile on her face and seemed really giddy for something that no one could pinpoint. "You're darn right I will, I'll be the bravest warrior on the seas," he proudly exclaimed, jabbing a thumb at his chest with a large grin on his face. "Good, you'll have to." Kaya's smile became even larger, along with Mary's, as if they knew something Luffy and the others didn't. "Because I'm coming with you all." She finished off happily, shocking everyone present except for Mary. But, you can't, right?" Usopp stuttered out in surprise. "Mary and I had a long talk about this already and he's approved of it. I've also thought about this long and hard, so don't try to stop me," she said with confidence and that same smile on her face. Before Usopp was going to argue again, Luffy spoke out. "Seeing as how steady you are in your position on the matter, what can you bring to the crew?" he asked curiously. "Well, I do have some medical knowledge, I can't fight very well, though," Kaya said, letting out a sheepish laugh at the end. "Well then," Luffy let out a large grin, "welcome to the crew, Kaya, Usopp," he shouted out, ending it with his classic laugh. Chapter 8. There. Got it. Luffy shouted from his spot on Mary's deck as he dropped the brush he was holding into the bucket of bluish paint next to him. "What the hell are you shouting about now, Luffy?" Zoro asked grumpily from his napping spot. "I've finished our mark," Luffy shouted out with a large grin on his face as he held up a black cloth that was their flag. By now, everyone else was up and out of the kitchen and observing the ruckus. "Guys. I was just about to come and get you, look at our pirate mark," Luffy shouted looking proud as he displayed his handmade mark. The pirate mark looked like a classic Jolly Roger, but instead of crossbones it had jagged shards of ice behind the skull, about half of the skull itself was ice, and Luffy's straw hat was on the head. "That's actually pretty good, Luffy," Nami said, looking genuinely surprised at Luffy's artistic skills. "Yeah, that's pretty good, Luffy," Usopp said before he got a proud smile on his face. "Though I must say, even though you're good, you'll never be as good as me." Luffy smirked from behind the flag and hid the amusement in his voice. "Really, if you're that amazing, paint this Jolly Roger on the sail, if I think it's better, I'll humbly admit your artistic superiority," Luffy said, barely hiding his amusement. Usopp grinned and jabbed a finger at Luffy. "You will regret that bet, I will paint it better, Luffy." "Then prove it," Luffy said in a challenging tone. Short skip. "That was rude, Luffy-san," Kaya scolded, aiming her gaze at Luffy. Luffy, Zoro, and Kaya were in the dining room while Nami looked out for any islands from the crow's nest and Usopp was still working on the sail. Zoro was sitting against the wall, sleeping, so he didn't have any input on the issue. He thought it was Usopp's fault for letting his pride get the better of him. He simply waved his hand as if hitting a fly. "Aw, it's fine. Your little boyfriend will make it through." Kaya shut her mouth in embarrassment at the word boyfriend. Luffy went to the fridge hoping to find any alcohol, most preferably wine, but any would work. "Everyone. I see an island ahead." This got everybody's attention and woke Zoro up. Luffy walked out of the dining room with Zoro and Kaya in tow. They looked in front of the ship and saw what Nami was talking about. A long ways in front of the ship was a huge landmass that looked like it was all just a large jungle. "Is it inhabited?" Luffy called up to Nami curiously. She looked down at the three and responded. "No, it doesn't look like it, so I think we should just skip it." "No," Luffy exclaimed. Everyone looked over at Luffy in curiosity. "I'll go scope it out first." Before anyone, mostly Nami and Usopp, could argue, Luffy jumped off the ship and landed on an ice patch he made. He looked up at the ship and called to his crew. "You guys stay here until we have to leave," he ordered, simultaneously freezing a path for him and running along it to the island. Short skip. Luffy stopped onto the island, he looked around and saw that the forest was quite large. I wonder. He closed his eyes and sent his observation Haki as far as he could. "Perfect, this will do," Luffy thought, grinning as he sensed some presences on the island. He looked back at the Mary, which was anchored in place. "What should I do? I'm too impatient for the ship to come over here." Luffy took up a thinking position before he dropped a fist into his palm. "That's it." Luffy made his way back to the ship, freezing himself a narrow path to walk on. When he made it to the ship, he shouted up. "Hey. We're going onto the island, so hurry out here." A few moments later, the rest of the crew looked over the railing and down at their captain, who was still on his small ice floe. "Well, get up here, we're going to the island aren't we?" Zoro asked irritably. "Shishishi, nope, we're walking," Luffy said with a grin on his face. "How are we going to walk there?" Kaya asked curiously. "Just be patient." Luffy smirked, kneeling down and putting his hand in the water and closing his eyes in concentration. After a few moments the crew got impatient. When Nami was about to shout out to Luffy to hurry, the water in front of him started to rise, like something incredibly large was going to surface. When the water broke to reveal the giant beast that rose from the ocean. The beast was a very large sea king, in East Blue standards. It looked like the sea king from Luffy's village, but at least twice as big and with red and black scales that glinted in the high afternoon sun. Ah, sea king. Nami and Usopp screamed out in fear, tears streaming down their faces. Hie was shocked still and Zoro crouched down, grabbing his sword's hilt, before he noticed that Luffy was as calm and cool, pun slightly intended, as he would be on any normal day. The Sea King seemed to ignore the ship and focus down on the crouching human before it, who seemed to be concentrating on something. Without any other thought, the Sea King lunged forward, its maw wide open, sending the crew into even more of a panic. "Ice Age!" Luffy shouted out, freezing the ocean and Sea King in place within pale ice. The entire crew was extremely shocked with Luffy's strength. Kaya fainted from shock, Zoro's eyes widened in surprise before he smirked with pride. He was following this man and didn't regret it one bit. Luffy sighed and stood up from his kneeling position. "Come on guys, this ice will only last for at least 2 or 3 days, and we're staying here for a day." Luffy called up to the ship, walking to the island with his crew following shortly behind, Kaya having regained consciousness. One short walk later, Zoro, Nami, Kaya and Usopp were sitting in front of Luffy, who was standing with the rainforest behind him. "Alright, I brought you guys here to tell you about something that will be needed when we go deep into the Grand Line, Haki." Luffy exclaimed with his hands on his hips. Usopp raised his hand with an eyebrow raised questioningly. "Yes Usopp?" Luffy asked curiously. "What is Haki?" Usopp asked with pure curiosity. "I was just about to get to that. Haki is the weaponization of your spirit or will." Everyone except for Zoro leaned forward in rapt attention. There are 2 forms of Haki that can be trained to anybody. First there is Kenbenshoku Haki. This form of Haki allows you to sense where people or creatures are if they are unable to be seen. If this form is mastered, it will allow you to predict your enemy's movements before they are made. Luffy explained. "That's amazing." Nami muttered in amazement, thinking of everything she could do if she mastered it. Her thoughts were interrupted, however, when a gargantuan tiger broke out from the forestry and hovered behind Luffy, baring its teeth in a snarl, licking its chops. The crew was shocked still as they watched the tiger stare at Luffy like prey. The second trainable form of Haki is called Busoshoku Haki. This Haki allows you to either put invisible armor over your body for defense or change your skin to armor itself. This form of Haki allows you to break through the defenses of a devil fruit user and hit them directly. This form of Haki also allows you to fuse it into weapons you're using, like my sword for example. When your weapons are infused with this Haki, it does extra damage than it would without it. Luffy continued his explanation, taking no notice of the gigantic tiger behind him. However, there's one form of Haki that cannot be trained, and only 1 in a million are born with it. The tiger stalked closer to Luffy, bringing out its claws. This form of Haki is called Hashoku Haki. This form is the most dangerous if left unstable and out of control. What you do with this Haki is putting your will against your enemy's will. Your enemy needs to be weaker than you in mind and body to be able to knock them out instantly. When this Haki is mastered, you can let out pulses of it in varying amounts of strength and time. The tiger was right behind Luffy by now and swung its paw down at Luffy from the left. "Luffy, look out." Nami shouted out, standing from her spot with Usopp and Zoro. She noticed he closed his eyes and was about to snap at him when his calm voice spoke out. "Don't worry, the paw is coming from the left." Luffy quickly leaned down and to the right, avoiding the paw by a mere foot. The giant tiger, seeing his first paw strike failed, he stomped on the ground where Luffy was at, only for the man to smoothly dodge each strike with his eyes closed. When the paw strike stopped, Luffy turned to look at his gobsmacked crew. That was Kenbenshoku Haki, when mastered. The tiger, now annoyed, lumbered up behind Luffy, raised its paw and brought it down fast. Luffy swiftly turned around and stuck his palm in the paw's path, coating with invisible armor. When the paw collided with Luffy's hand, the entire tiger was blasted back with an immense force, causing it to nearly lose consciousness. Luffy turned back around to his crew again. That was Busoshoku Haki in its near mastery. What I'm about to show you is Hashoku Haki, please pay attention. Luffy turned back around to face the enraged tiger now coming back from the last hit. The tiger was about to strike at Luffy again, but stopped when Luffy glared at it and sent out a wave of Hashoku Haki. The giant tiger started sweating profusely and looked terrified. It slowly started to make its way back to the forest before it collapsed on its side, unconscious and with a look of fear frozen on its face. Amazing. The sun's still out, I thought you said we were going to stay here for a day. Nami said after looking up at the sky and seeing it was still somewhere around noon. Well, that's simple, I'm going to train you guys a little bit in Haki and some other techniques. Luffy said with a large grin on his face and turning towards the still unconscious tiger. Let's eat first, though. As if agreeing, his stomach grumbled in hunger. After devouring the tiger. Okay, first I want to tell you guys what you are going to learn specifically. Luffy explained, sitting on the forest floor in front of his crew. Zoro, you're going to learn Busoshoku Haki, and Soru, you will be the one who'll need both the most at the moment. I'll go over how you learn it later, so be patient. Luffy said, focusing on Zoro before switching his sights onto Nami, Usopp, and Kaya. You three will earn Kenbenshoku Haki. Nami, you could use it for detecting the weather better. Usopp, you could use it to help with your sniping, and Kaya, it could help you with detecting things wrong with patience. Luffy said, informing them of what they will be taught. How are we going to learn this stuff, anyway? Zoro asked inquisitively. I'll get to that. Now, Usopp, do you have any bandanas or blindfolds? Usopp nodded in affirmative and handed one over to Luffy. The way you are going to learn Kenbenshoku Haki is effective but lengthy. One of you is going to wear this bandana over your eyes so that you don't see a thing, while the other is going to swing at the blinded person with a blunt object. Luffy explained, holding up the bandana. Nami and Usopp's eyes widened in shock. What? There is no way in hell that I'm doing that. Nami shouted in an outrage with an angry shark tooth expression. Calm down, you just have calm down and try to sense your surroundings, it'll be easy. Luffy said nonchalantly. Aya, you are going to learn in a different way. You're going to need to meditate for at least 10 to 15 minutes every day. I'm sure you'll be able to unlock it with enough practice. Luffy explained to Kaya. Aya just nodded with a small smile on her face. Luffy stood up with his grin in place. You guys get started, Zoro, come with me. Luffy said, motioning Zoro to follow as Usopp and Nami played Janken to decide who was blindfolded. Zoro stood up with a grunt and followed Luffy for a short while until they came upon a clearing that was wide and had a gigantic boulder in the middle that was at least 20 meters wide and 25 meters high. What you are going to do first is bury your katana to the hilt in that boulder. Luffy pointed at the boulder while keeping eye contact with Zoro by infusing them with Busoshoku Haki. Zoro let out a wolfish smirk. That's it. His smirk dropped, however, when Luffy shook his head no. You'll cut this boulder with Haki enhanced swords while I put a little bit of Haki into the boulder. This should help with you unlocking your Haki. Luffy explained, going to stand by the boulder and put his hand on it, infusing Haki into it. I'll just hit it with everything I've got, then. Zoro said, drawing his 3 swords and putting one in his mouth. Zoro closed his eyes and concentrated, trying to put his spirit into his blades. He brought his 2 swords up and positioned them behind the blade of Wadden, with the blade points pointing to the ground. Santoryu. Torgari. Zoro shouted out, dashing forward and bringing his swords down on the boulder with as much spirit and strength as possible. Only to have the blades cut 1 inch into the boulder before stopping. Zoro's eyes widened in shock. I put everything into it, yet nothing happened. Again, this time, try to let it come naturally, don't force it. Luffy informed, trying to help Zoro without holding his hand throughout the whole thing. Zoro just grunted in affirmative and got back into position, putting his swords into a triangular positioning. He closed his eyes, relaxed his breathing. Once he felt a slight tug in his gut, he let his instincts take the lead. Luffy stayed in his position next to the boulder, keeping the Haki flowing into the boulder. When he saw a slight shimmer around Zoro's blades, he smirked proudly. He's unlocked it this early, too, we're gonna do great in the Grand Line. Zoro started spinning his 2 blades at an increasing speed until they were blurs. Santoryu Aogi. Zoro started off, before he dashed ahead at blinding speeds, Sans and Sekai. He finished off, slicing at the rock. Zoro stopped on the other side of the boulder, with his blades held in front and behind him, as he took deep breaths from the exertion of using the technique in Haki for the first time. Both Zoro and Luffy heard the telltale sound of stone sliding against stone. They looked where Zoro cut and saw a 2-foot wedge of cleanly cut stone sliding out of the boulder, before it dropped to the ground with a dull thud, kicking up a small dust cloud. Luffy grinned proudly at his first mate's achievement. Nice job, Zoro. Thanks, Captain. Zoro said as he sheathed his swords. Scene skip. Usopp was sitting in front of a stick-wielding Nami with a nervous frown on his lips and a blindfold over his eyes. Just calm down and try to sense everything around you. Usopp reminded himself as he took deep breaths to calm himself and tried to extend his senses out to the forest. Behind him, Nami raised her stick and brought it down as hard as she could, smacking Usopp right in the head, producing a large teeming bump and a tearful twitching Usopp on the forest floor. Usopp, come on. It can't be that hard. Nami complained, letting her arms drop to her sides. If you think it's so easy, why don't you try it? Usopp questioned, pulling his head up and frowning at her. I wonder how long it took Luffy to unlock this. Nami thought to herself. I bet it took a while. Usopp said with a thoughtful expression. He thought of Luffy trying to dodge the stick with his eyes blindfolded before getting smacked aside by said stick painfully. A while for what? A voice called from the edge of the small clearing, breaking their train of thought. Usopp and Nami looked up at the voice. Kaya was still meditating and saw Luffy walk into the clearing with an exhausted Zoro stumbling in behind him. How long did it take you to discover Kenbenshoku Haki? Nami asked curiously as soon as he walked in. My Haki was unlocked when I was 7 years old. Luffy said bluntly after a moment of silent thought, surprising Nami and Usopp. Zoro slumped against a tree and fell asleep from exhaustion. How did you manage to do that? Usopp and Nami exclaimed in shock. Sometimes Haki can be emerged when you experience large amount stress in your life, or it can be unlocked through intense training. Luffy was going to continue with his explanation when Usopp raised a hand in questioning. Luffy just nodded his head to Usopp, motioning him to continue. Can Haki emerge from a single stressful moment, or? Usopp trailed off, letting the rest of the question hang in the air. It can be a single moment, but that would have to be nearly mind-shattering for it to happen. That is why I want you guys to learn the least mentally harmful way. Luffy explained to his crew. You still haven't told us how your Haki emerged, Luffy-san. Kaya called from her meditating position, startling Nami and Usopp. Luffy shrugged in a carefree way. I might as well, it's not secret anyway. Sit down, it might be a long story. Luffy said, plopping down on the forest floor, crossing his legs as he went down. When I was a kid, my grandpa threw me into the forest alone for me to survive for a certain amount of time. One night I was running from a pack of wolves that were chasing me down so they could eat me. This garnered many shocked stares from those conscious. Anyway, I was running for my life when I stumbled into a clearing and saw the largest tree I've ever seen that had a hollow point where I could climb in and hide, so I did that, and when I climbed in, I saw a devil fruit. I didn't know what it was at the time, so I just ate it and I found out that I had ice powers from the fruit. Luffy continued with his story. Anyway, I fell asleep in the tree and woke up the next morning, so I walked around the forest testing my abilities on random things when I saw a clearing where I saw the wolves from the night before resting. I was going to freeze the ground to keep them still when they ran off, sounding terrified of something. I was very confused when I felt a gust of warm air hit the back of my neck. When I turned around, I saw a tiger that was at least half the size of the one earlier today. Their eyes widened to the size of saucers at this point. Since I was a child, it scared me shitless, and I hightailed it away with the tiger following me, knocking down trees like they were wet paper towels. I kept running when I ran into a clearing that had a giant boulder that I had to stop in front of, so the tiger caught up with me and was cornering me. I was so scared that I was going to die. I used my powers on a scale I never did at the time and froze the ground and the tiger, unconsciously using Hashoku Haki, knocking out all of the animals that surrounded the clearing I was in. Luffy finished off his story, slightly shivering at the memory of that day when he finished his story. That seriously happened to you? Usopp asked, highly shocked. How old were you? I was 7 at the time. Luffy stated bluntly before he looked up at the sky to see the sun was going down and turning night fast. About. It's night time, you guys better get some sleep, I'll keep first watch. Luffy said, ignoring the shocked stares from his crew before he jumped to the top of a tree and sat on the highest branch, closing his eyes and leaning against the tree trunk, still on guard and soon falling into the land of dreams. Flashback 10 years ago. Boy, Luffy. Wake up, we gotta go hunting if we want some food tonight. A childish voice shouted out. Luffy turned to the voice and saw a raven-haired child wearing shorts, an elbow pad on his left elbow, a tank top, had an old lead pipe in his hand, and had freckles on his cheeks. Luffy yawned a bit before getting from his position on his sleeping mat and ran after the freckled child with a large smile on his face. I'm coming, Ace. Just be patient. Luffy shouted, following Ace into the forest. We're getting Sabo, right? He asked, earning him a light bop on his head. Of course we are, stupid, we always bring him along. Ace lightly scolded with a mock glare pointed at Luffy. Luffy returned the mock glare and lightly shoved Ace with a slight smirk on his childish face. Whatever, let's get going. Luffy said, running ahead of Ace. The two children ran for a short bit until they burst into a clearing and the dream stopped abruptly there. Dream end. Luffy's eyes snapped open with a slight gasp. He looked down the tree and saw Marines closing in on his crew. Why would they attack them? Luffy thought before he looked and saw the ship and mentally smacked himself in the forehead. I should have put flag away. The Marines assumed that the humans were the pirates that landed there and that one of them had a devil fruit power. Luffy dropped down onto the ground when one of the Marines were about to cuff Kaya and Usopp. Luffy instantly heard the sound of rifles clicking and swords being drawn. Who are you and what are you doing here? The supposed leader of the small Marine squad demanded. My name is Monkey D. Luffy and what I'm doing here is none of your goddamn business. Luffy nearly growled, glaring at the leader with his hand on his sword. What I wanna know is why you're trying to kidnap my friends here. You all are the only other human inhabitants on the island right now and that pirate ship wasn't there when we arrived, same with that ice. So, we're going to take these people to our ship to interrogate them, along with you, and confiscate that ship. The Marine leader said, drawing his sword. Looks like a fight is on my hands. Zoro. A tired groan came as a reply from the green-haired swordsman. Get the others to the ship and take out any Marines that try to stop you, we're leaving the island on early notice. Luffy said, drawing his sword, still glaring at the marine leader. Alright Captain, you better make it to the ship. Zoro said, rushing to pick up Nami, Usopp and Kaya, who were all stirring awake from the commotion. Bonk, what the hell are you doing? Nami shouted at Zoro before anything else that was said died out in the forest. What's your name anyway? Luffy asked, staying on guard in case of a surprise attack and keeping his observation Haki open to detect any surprises. I am Captain Riley of the 73rd East Blue Branch, assigned to eliminate any and all pirates. Riley said with an authoritative tone as his men put their guards up. All of you, go after the runaways, I'll deal with this one. Riley said, making his men rush into action. Nketsu Sara Heki. Luffy shouted, spreading his arms out to his sides, freezing the moisture in the air in the blink of an eye into a gargantuan ice wall that was a meter thick and 20 meters into the sky. Luffy looked at all of the marines with a lopsided grin and an excited glint in his eyes. None of you are leaving this area alive. His serious tone of voice sent shivers down everybody's spines, except for Riley who was studying the ice wall with surprise and shock. So you froze the ocean? Riley asked seriously with his marine cap shadowing his expression. Not waiting for an answer, Riley snapped his head up and shouted out. This man is now our top priority, take him down in the name of justice. The soldiers looked at Riley in confusion before charging at Luffy who didn't move from his spot despite the mass of charging marines. 75 total marines excluding Riley. 50 of them are charging with swords while the rest are waiting to shoot. Easy. Luffy smirked silently to himself as the marines closed in on him. I can't use my Hashoku Haki yet, the others aren't ready for the stronger marines yet. He thought as he blocked a sword strike, backing up to his ice wall, dodging a second strike. One of the marines stabbed at Luffy, who ducked and kicked said marine in the gut, sending him flying into the crowd of marines behind him. Yubuki Dan. Luffy shouted out, thrusting his sword forward, sending a pale blue wind bullet through a marine that charged him and at the marine that tried to stab him earlier. The marines coughed out blood and collapsed unconscious from blood loss and continued to bleed out profusely from their wounds. Now then, Luffy said with a carefree tone, grinning like a wolf, let's have some fun, shall we? With that, Luffy jumped into the center of the mass of marines and dropped into a handstand. Renkyaku. Zennen. Luffy shouted, spinning his legs in a rapid circle, sending a circle airblade out, slicing marines across their torsos and cutting a foot into the ice wall. If you want to take me down, you'll have to try harder than that. Luffy smirked, landing on his feet. 60 left. He counted. Take him out at all costs. Riley shouted, pointing his sword at Luffy. The marines charged Luffy with renewed vigor, shouting out battle cries. This might actually be fun. Luffy said to himself with a hint of amusement, turning his left hand into ice. Parrying a sword strike from a marine, Luffy threw his frozen fist forward, hitting the marine in the face and giving him minor frostbite from the harsh contact of ice on flesh. Luffy dodged a strike coming from behind him and slashed the attacker across his chest, sending blood flying from the wound and making him topple forward, unconscious. Luffy snapped his eyes around at the crowd of marines around him before sighing. This'll take too long, so I might as well end it right now. Luffy said with a lazy frown on his face. Luffy sheathed his sword and turned his arm back to flesh and bone. Zoro.star Luffy disappeared from the side of the marines and appeared in the sky with the right side of his face and right arm turned into ice. Shoot him down. Riley shouted, making the marines who had rifles start to unload on Luffy, but missed their shots. I see my crew made it back to the ship. Luffy muttered to himself, seeing his crew lumber back onto the ship from his position in the sky. In any case, I have to finish this. Luffy raised his right arm across his chest into the sky and froze the moisture into multiple large boulders of ice. He dropped his arm in a slashing motion, the boulders following and dropping down onto the marines, as if they were meteors. Haimu. Luffy shouted out, keeping up his relentless attack on the marines until he knew that they were all either unconscious, dead or lost their will to fight. When the boulders of ice stopped, Luffy landed on top of his ice wall and sighted his work. There were craters and limp bodies galore from his attack, then Luffy frowned. Not a single one of them is standing, man, the East Blue has weak marines. Well, except for Smokey, his fruit is powerful. Luffy muttered to himself before he noticed a quick click and flash come from the forest floor. He snapped his head over to where he heard the noise and only heard scurrying footsteps. Damn it, already got a bounty picture. Fucking sneaky marine photographers, always on my nerves. He mentally grumbled. He looked over to the ship and jumped off of his ice wall. Epo.star he said, kicking the air beneath him to keep him from plummeting to the forest floor. Going Mary, what's happening Usopp? Nami asked the long-nosed sniper who had binoculars up to his eyes. Well, he's on top of his frozen wall. He's looking at us, now he jumped off. Usopp said, narrating what he saw from his Sub-Zero captain. So he's on his way, that's good. Zoro said from his spot leaning on the railing. A minute later, Luffy dropped from the sky and landed on the ship, startling a sleeping Zoro awake and causing Usopp to yelp a bit in shock. Just as Usopp was going to ask questions, Luffy held his hand up for silence. "Get this ship moving as quick as possible, the Marines are after us," Luffy ordered sternly, walking to the front of the ship and standing on the figurehead. "I thought you took care of them. Did you leave the job half finished?" Nami shouted from the kitchen door with an annoyed expression on her face. Nami's expression changed to surprise and shock when Luffy turned his head to her and leveled a serious gaze at her with one eye. "You will heed my order and get this ship moving, is that clear?" Luffy asked her with a low serious tone. Nami nodded quickly and got Zoro and Usopp moving to set the sails and raise the anchor. When the Going Merry started moving, the marine galleon showed up gunning at them from behind at full speed and catching up quickly. "Ah. The Marines," Usopp shouted with Nami. Zoro stood with confidence in his posture and arms crossed while Luffy drew his sword and walked to the back of the ship. "Luffy, what are you going to do?" Zoro asked curiously with a raised eyebrow. "Take out the trash," Luffy said seriously, knocking his hat to hang off of his neck. When the Marines started opening fire, Luffy held his sword in front of him with both hands and closed his eyes in concentration, taking deep breaths. "It's more difficult from this far, but they're still in range," Luffy thought to himself, focusing on the ship at least 200 meters away. "Itoryu," Luffy said, raising his sword as if ready to strike an opponent. Zoro's eyes widened in disbelief and shock as he saw what Luffy was doing. "No, that's impossible. Only someone like him is capable of this," Zoro thought in shock. "The Kami-Kiri," Luffy shouted, swinging his sword down in a fast motion. For a split second, nothing happened, but then the marine ship split in half, cleanly sliced down the middle with frost at the edge of the cut. The two halves of the marine ship sank into the ocean with screaming marines falling with it as well. Luffy sheathed his sword and started walking back to the kitchen. When he walked past his crew, who snapped out of their stupor, he ordered in an authoritative voice. "Come with me to the kitchen, I'll explain everything there," Luffy said, not stopping in his strides to walk to the kitchen. The crew hurried in their footsteps to follow their captain as he entered the kitchen and sat at the head of the table. Hie looked startled at the sudden arrival of the crew. She turned to Luffy with a questioning look. He gave her a stay silent and listen look. She nodded and stayed silent. "I bet you all have a lot of questions." Luffy was answered with numerous nods from the crew. "Well, you all better get comfortable, because this is a long story," Luffy said as the crew leaned forward on the table with rapt attention. Chapter 9. "So you trained on the Grand Line for 10 years?" Usopp asked shocked. "Yep," Luffy answered shortly. "And because I was mostly in paradise with Shanks, the Marines there got sight of me with Shanks and sent out a shit ton of reports about Shanks having an apprentice, so they started to try to hunt me down to gauge my strength, I guess." "So, what are you trying to say here?" Usopp asked, drawing the O out in so. Luffy sighed before he leaned on the table with a serious expression on his face. "What I'm trying to say is that we'll face stronger Marines earlier than expected. There's also a small possibility that one of the 3 admirals will come after us, seeing as how the world government found out that I was trained by one of the Yonkou and due to my little display earlier. If we do run into any of the admirals or vice admirals, leave them to me unless told otherwise, understood?" Luffy questioned seriously. The crew nodded their heads affirmative and were about to leave when Luffy's voice stopped them again. "This means that you'll need to double your training regimen, so I'm going to train you all in Kenbun-shoku Haki and Busashoku Haki," Luffy said with finality in his tone, leaving no room for argument in his voice. The crew nodded to Luffy's orders and got up from the table, with Luffy following behind. Time skipped 3 days. The crew were all outside doing their own thing. Zoro was cleaning his swords, Usopp constructing some ammo for his slingshot. Nami was lying on a lawn chair reading through a newspaper with a slight frown on her face at the slightly increased price. Kayu was simply meditating, trying to focus on unlocking her Haki. Glancing at the door of Luffy's cabin, Usopp gained a curious look in his eye. "Hey Zoro," Usopp said to Zoro, gaining a grunt of notice from the green-haired swordsman, "why do you think that Luffy has his own cabin?" Usopp asked curiously. "You mean besides the fact he's the captain?" Zoro asked in a dry tone, gaining a nod in response from the long-nosed sniper. Zoro stopped cleaning his swords for a moment and thought for a bit before he shrugged it off and went back to cleaning his sword. "Well, it's not really my business, but if you're curious, go check for yourself," Zoro said nonchalantly. Usopp looked a bit bummed at the dismissal, but shrugged and crept over to Luffy's cabin quickly but quietly. When he got in front of the door, he saw that the window on the door looked misted over and he could see his breath whenever he exhaled and he was soon shivering from the sudden and strange drop in temperature. Zoro looked up from cleaning his swords when he heard Usopp shivering and saw that the sniper of the crew had walked back from Luffy's cabin door and was feverishly rubbing his arms. "The hell is wrong with you?" It's SSOCC cold in F front of his DD door. Usopp managed to stutter out as he gradually managed to get his body temperature back to normal. Weird, do you think that Luffy freezes his room? Zoro asked Usopp, who quickly nodded in agreement. Luffy's cabin. Luffy was sitting on his bed in a meditative state with a large majority of his room frozen. The only things not frozen were his bed, desk, and the cabin door. On the desk was a cup of water, untouched and unaffected by the frigid temperatures of the room. Just need to freeze the water without movement. Luffy muttered to himself, even with all of the years he's trained with it, there are still things he can't do. Freezing things from a distance without movement was one of them. Luffy took a deep slow breath and concentrated on the water. After a few moments of tense silence, Luffy saw the water begin to freeze from the bottom up in a fraction of a second. Now to bring it to me. Luffy thought, keeping his concentration on the frozen water. Slowly, the ice began to lift out of the glass and float towards Luffy in a steady airborne path. When the ice reached Luffy, it broke into multiple tiny chunks of ice that then slowly started to revolve around Luffy in a circular motion like multiple planets around star. Unknown to Luffy, Nami had been shouting his name from the deck when she reached the article that included the events from their most recent island and showing Luffy's new bounty poster. It read, "Wanted dead or alive, Aoki Monkey D. Luffy, 60 million Beery." After a whole 5 minutes of not getting a response from Luffy, which really annoyed and angered Nami to the point where she stomped up to his cabin door and started shouting at it, hoping against HOPAN. Am I using that right? That Luffy could hear her. After a full minute or so of shouting, Nami looked poet at the utter lack of response from her Sub-Zero captain. "Luffy, if you don't open this door in 15 seconds, I'm barging in." Nami shouted, finally losing her temper. "Didn't Luffy say to knock first?" Zoro asked Nami from his spot, remembering Luffy's warning from before. Seeing Nami ignore his question, Zoro shrugged and went back to relaxing against the railing. Not my fault she isn't listening. He thought boredly. In his cabin, Luffy was oblivious to the raging red head outside of his cabin door and continued focusing on the chunks of ice orbiting around him. So far, so good. Luffy thought, slightly exhausted with the mental strain he was under. Now shift them into needles. He thought, the ice chunks narrowing and elongating into sharp needles about 3 inches long each. Luffy's train of thought and concentration was broken when his door was slammed open, making the hinges nearly break from the force of the door being opened and revealing an annoyed Nami. When the door was abruptly opened, Luffy's multiple ice needles shot towards the door at a blistering pace with the intent to murder, before they abruptly stopped a quarter inch from Nami's person, causing her to freeze in place with wide eyes and sweat pouring down her body. "I told you all to knock before entering, I thought you were an enemy," Luffy said with a quiet tone as he dissipated his ice needles. "I just wanted to show you this newspaper," Nami said nervously, holding out the paper she was clutching in her hand. "Alright, gimme here," Luffy said boredly, holding his hand out. Dropping the paper into his hand, Nami slightly backed up a step as Luffy silently read the article. Earlier this week a new rookie pirate by the name of Monkey D. Luffy, captain of an unnamed pirate crew who bears the Jolly Roger with the appearance of a half-frozen skull with ice shards for crossbones and a straw hat atop its head, has wreaked havoc against 2 squadrons of marines and is told to be extremely powerful and dangerous. Marines advise you to steer clear of this rookie pirate as he is believed to have the power of a Loja devil fruit and exceptional swordsmanship that may even be equal that of Hawkeye's Dracula Mihawk, which was shown by slicing a marine battleship in half from a large distance away. It is also believed that this man has been seen with one of the Yonko, red-haired Shanks, and trained with him for an extended amount of time. After Luffy finished reading the article, he lowered his eyes to his wanted poster and a proud smirk spread across his face at his large bounty. The picture on the poster seemed to only enforce the terrifying reputation shown by the newspaper. The picture showed Luffy standing on the wall he made when he fought the Marines with a glare pointed somewhere out of frame. 60 million, huh? Luffy asked himself with his smirk on his face. Told him I'd do it. Why are you so proud? Do you know how many people are going to be after us now? Not only the Marines, but other pirates and some bounty hunters too, Nami said with slight annoyance. Luffy sighed to himself again. Nami, look, I already told you we'd face stronger Marines earlier than expected, plus, we're pirates, so you should have expected this. Luffy said, silencing for a moment to allow what he said to sink into Nami's head. Now, get out, I need to make an important call, Luffy said in a stern tone, ushering Nami out of his cabin. The Sub-Zero captain sighed as he walked to his desk, sat down on his spinning chair and opened a cabinet at a bottom corner of it and pulled out a transponder snail and put it on the desk, dropping the paper on it as well. Now who to call? Luffy thought silently for a few moments before plucking the receiver off of the and dialing a number and listened to the piru-piru from the snail for a few moments before somebody picked up. Hello? Who is this? A drowsy voice called out from the other end with a groan accompanying the voice. Shanks, it's good to hear your hungover voice after so long. Luffy answered in a cheery voice with a wide grin on his face. Anchor? Shanks asked in slight shock before he shouted out to his crew. Hey, guys, anchor's on the snail. Luffy could practically hear the grin on Shanks' face. Many tired and pained groans sounded from the snail, making Luffy presume that Shanks and his crew woke up from a night of intense drinking. Hey, Anchor. He's Callan. Tell him I said hi. How's it going, Anchor? Shanks asked curiously, still sounding elated. Well, I called to tell you that I just got my first bounty, and you may be shocked. Luffy said, reclining in his chair and putting his legs on the desk. Oh? Why's that? Shanks asked in a more curious tone now. My first bounty as a pirate is 60 million beery. Luffy said in a proud and blunt manner. There was silence for a few moments before there was a lot of grumbling and slight jingling of coin purses being tossed around. Luffy blinked silently for a few moments before he looked incredulously at the snail. You bet on my bounty? Luffy asked with a shocked expression. Yeah, almost half of the crew bet that you'd get your bounty when you got to paradise, the other half bet that you'd get it before paradise. Shanks said, while there was a jingle of coins louder than the rest. You can guess what I bet on. Shanks said with a cheerful voice. I can't tell if that's faith in me or knowing I'd get into some type of trouble before paradise. Luffy joked, dropping his legs off of the desk and leaning on his elbows. Ha. Maybe it's better to leave that unanswered, Anchor. Shanks joked back with an uproarious laugh. Luffy was going to try and make new conversation when he heard his crew shouting from the deck. Shanks, I gotta go, something's going on with my crew. Luffy said, taking a glance at his door. Alright Anchor, see you later. Be sure to get that bounty higher by the time we meet again. Shanks exclaimed with a challenging tone in his voice. You're damn right I will, tomato hair. Luffy said before slamming the receiver down, cutting the call off before Shanks could retort and walked out of his cabin and saw Zoro, Usopp, Kaya, Nami, and a man he's never seen before all surrounding a very sick-looking man that was collapsed on the floor. What the hell's going on out here? Luffy thought with a curious eyebrow raised. Hey, what's happening out here? Luffy called out, voicing his thoughts. Well, Usopp here wanted to test out the cannon and fired it at an outcrop and injured these two people. Nami explained with a frown on her face, glancing at Usopp. I said I was sorry. The long-nosed sniper grumbled. Anyway, turns out that one of the people Usopp shot at has scurvy, and they both know Zoro. Nami explained while Kaya told Usopp to get some lemonade from the kitchen. Really? What are your names, then? Luffy asked the young man, jumping down onto the deck. My name is Johnny, the healthy man spoke. He had tanned skin, dark sunglasses, black hair. He was wearing an overcoat with a shirt and a pair of shorts under the jacket and the kanji for sea tattooed on his cheek and a sword at his waist. And my sick friend here is Yusaku. Johnny motioned down to Yusaku, who was now having lemonade poured into his mouth through a funnel. How do you know Zoro? Luffy asked curiously. We were actually bounty hunters with each other for a while. Johnny replied. I see, well any friend of Zoro is a friend of mine, welcome on board. Luffy said with a grin on his face. Before any conversation could be made, Yusaku shot up into a sitting position with his arms wide over his head. I'm alive. He shouted out in a joyful voice and started dancing around with Johnny. Could you please lay back down, you're not healed yet. Kaya asked politely trying to get the duo to calm down. Aniki. Johnny shouted out in panic as Yusaku collapsed on the wooden deck, looking worse off than before. Of course that would happen, you don't heal that fast. Nami shouted with a tick mark pulsing on her forehead. Short skip. Yusaku was resting in a guest room while everyone else was on the deck doing their own thing, but Zoro, Johnny, and Luffy were talking amongst themselves. By the way, Luffy. Zoro said. Luffy hummed in answer. What were you doing in your cabin, anyway? Zoro asked curiously. Meditating, mostly. Luffy said. Meditating? The two swordsmen asked. Yeah. I also talked to an old friend to tell him about my bounty. Luffy said with a grin. You got a bounty? How much? Zoro asked curiously with a little bit of envy in his eyes. 60 million. Luffy said proudly, leaving Zoro and Johnny gobsmacked. That's 20 times larger than the average East Blue bounty. Johnny exclaimed in shock. Anyway, I need a new crew member and I'm thinking they should be a fighting cook. Luffy said, tossing aside the previous topic like nothing. At this, Johnny slightly smirked. I know just the place where you can get a cook that can fight great. Really? Luffy asked in curiosity. Yeah, it's called Baratie, and it's pretty much like a restaurant boat, but you probably shouldn't go looking like you usually do, the newspapers are probably already around all of East Blue, I bet. Johnny said warningly. I guess he's right. Luffy thought, putting his hand under his chin in a thinking position. Suddenly his face brightened up and smacked his fist down in his palm in an I got it motion. That's it. Luffy looked at his curious crewmate and the suspicious swordsman, Yay, alliteration, kinda. With a grin on his face. I'm gonna be in my room for a bit, call out for me if there's trouble. Luffy said cheerfully, then hurrying up to his cabin and shut the door. What's he going to do? Johnny asked Zoro. I've got no idea what goes on in that ice cap brain of his. Zoro said in a dry tone. Luffy's cabin, alright, let's change my look. Luffy said to himself, walking to his wardrobe and pulling open the cabinets. Letting his gaze skim through the articles of clothing, he stopped his searching and found the perfect clothing for the Baratie standards, or what he thought they were, anyway. Luffy pulled out a hanger that had a black suit jacket with a chain in the breast pocket, connecting to the jacket itself with matching black dress pants and red button-up dress shirt and a black tie. Luffy grinned. Perfect. After getting changed, leaning his sword against his desk, and placing his straw hat on his desk, he remembered that he could still be recognized by someone really perceptive. Better safe than sorry. Luffy muttered to himself. Closing his eyes, he took a deep breath and concentrated, cooling the air around his hair, making frost coat his hair, giving the look of messy white hair. When Luffy opened his eyes were an ice blue color, all in all, no one would even recognize him at all. Proud of his disguise, Luffy smirked and got a black pair of dress socks and shoes and put them on when he heard shouting from outside his door. Marines are here. Hearing this, Luffy stood up and picked up his hat and let it hang on his neck, and as he was about to leave his cabin, he stopped and glanced at his sword. Might as well bring it. I have a feeling I'm gonna need it. Luffy thought, grabbing his sword and placing it on his hip. When he left his cabin, he came upon a curious sight that included a marine ship off to the right of the Going Merry. Johnny and Yusaku were on the ground, defeated with bruises on their bodies and multiple papers strewn about the deck around them, most likely bounty posters, given their profession. Usopp was shaking like a leaf with his slingshot clutched in one hand and the other in his satchel. Zoro was standing with his hands on his swords, ready to draw, and Kaya and Nami were watching the scene with worried expressions, but Nami had her hands discreetly creeping to her tri-section bow staff strapped to her lower back. What's going on here? Luffy called out, gathering the attention of his crew and the Marines. Ignoring his captain's new appearance, Zoro answered honestly. These Marines are hassling us because of our flag. After a few moments, Luffy walked to the front of the ship and stood at the railing, facing the Marines. May I have the names of our oh-so-friendly Marines? Luffy asked with a sarcastic tone, glancing ahead of the ship. That must be Baratie. He thought to himself, seeing what looked like a large ship out in the distance. I am Lieutenant Fullbody, who is this ship's captain? Fullbody said, looking peeved at Luffy's sarcasm. You're speaking to him. Luffy said in a serious tone, slightly narrowing his icy blue eyes at the lieutenant. I don't recognize your mark, but you're still pirates, so we're gonna have to sink you. Fullbody said as a blonde woman with brown eyes, bright red lipstick and a reddish-pink dress that showed off her cleavage. Luffy narrowed his eyes at the Marine lieutenant and immediately pieced it together. Is he doing this just to impress a woman? He thought with slight exasperation. Some of the Marines walked to the railing facing the ship with a loaded cannon. They're gonna sink us. Usopp shouted in panic. Sink it. The lieutenant said, confirming Usopp's panicked words. The Marines fired the cannon without much hesitation, making the crew, except for Luffy and Zoro, panic. As the cannonball neared the ship, Luffy drew his sword and sliced the cannonball in half, both halves flying off into the ocean. When Luffy looked back at the Marine ship, it was already sailing off to Baratie. Well shit, they're running with their tail between their legs. Usopp, Johnny, Kaya, and Yusaku all looked shocked and surprised at the nonchalance Luffy showed cutting a cannonball clean in half. Zoro looked nonchalant if not the least bit proud at the strength of Luffy. Nami's expression, however, was shadowed by her bangs with a wanted poster tightly clutched in her hands. Even if Luffy couldn't see it well, he saw that the poster was for the fisherman pirate, Sawtooth Arlong. After a few moments, Luffy shrugged and walked to the figurehead and sat down with his legs crossed. Closing his eyes, Luffy touched up on his Kenbenshoku Haki, managing to cover a radius of 1.5 kilometers, but could still vaguely sense many very weak presences just outside of his field of view. But there was one presence that stood out and dwarfed the other presences by exponential amounts and felt somewhat familiar. Luffy opened his eyes and found that they were docking at the Baratie, and he saw the Marine ship next to them. When Merry was fully anchored, Luffy stood and jumped onto the wooden dock. Come on guys. We're not gonna leave this place until we get a sea cook to come with us. Luffy exclaimed up to the ship, walking up to the doors with his crew following close behind. When Luffy opened the doors, he only had time to walk up to the podium to get seated when he felt a small gust of wind rush past him and the surprised yelps of Nami and Kaya. I cannot express words that can fully describe how my heart has stopped at your beauty and grace, just like a perfectly blossomed rose. Mademoiselle3. A nicely dressed blonde-haired man with his left eye covered by his bangs leaving his right eye, that was now a pink pulsing heart, with a swirled eyebrow, a bit of stubble on his chin with a cigarette in his mouth, with smoky hearts puffing out from the tobacco stick. Luffy, are we really going to get a cook from here if there are idiots like this one? Zoro asked in a gruff voice, pointing an annoyed glare at the blonde man. "Who are you calling an idiot, you moss-headed ogre?" The man almost growled out in anger, glaring heatedly at Zoro. Zoro's eyebrow twitched at the insult and was going to retort when Luffy interrupted. "Excuse me, sir, but we would like a table for." Luffy looked back at the group and silently counted to himself before turning his attention back to the blonde man. "7 people, please." Luffy asked politely. The man smiled slightly at the manners the strange but fancy-looking man had. "Of course, right this way. By the way, my name is Sanji." The man, now known as Sanji, said, starting to walk towards a table near a spiraling staircase. "Like we care, dartboard." Zoro muttered loud enough for Sanji to hear. "What did you say, mosshead?" Sanji growled with an annoyed glare. "Sanji-kun, could you please lead to our tables?" Nami asked with a pleading expression, causing Sanji's eye to turn into a heart again and gain a stupid grin on his face. "Hi. With pleasure, Mademoiselle," Sanji sang, kneeling by Nami holding her hand in his. "This knight's heart is yours to command, princess." A few grueling minutes of arguing and sweet-talking later, the Sub-Zero pirates were sitting at a round circular table with multiple different drinks in front of each respective crew member. Luffy and Zoro had 2 bottles of sake each to themselves, Kaya had a cup of tea, Nami had orange juice, and Usopp, Johnny and Yasaku each had a glass of water. "So who should we invite onto the crew?" Zoro asked in a bored tone with his hands behind his head. As Luffy was going to answer, he heard a loud crash of plates shattering against the ground, accompanied with the splashing of some sort of liquid. "Are you trying to make a fool of me?" An enraged voice shouted from a nearby table, gathering the restaurant's attention. Lieutenant Fullbody was standing with his fists clenched at his sides and shaking with unbridled rage, glaring at Sanji, whose expression was shadowed by his bangs. The blonde chef knelt down and looked at the shards of the soup dish that were scattered about in a shallow puddle of the soup itself. "I spent 3 days making that soup." Sanji muttered to himself. "I ask you a question, who the hell do you take me for?" Fullbody asked in annoyance. "Can money fill your stomach?" Sanji asked quietly after a few moments. "Huh? I said can money fill your stomach?" Sanji said in a clear voice with an angry tone. Why Fullbody's rant was interrupted when Sanji gave a brutal kick to his jaw, nearly shattering it on impact and making him cough out a mouthful of blood. Before the lieutenant could collapse, Sanji grabbed him by his shirt and lifted him in the air. Wasting a perfectly fine meal on the sea is the worst mistake you can make, especially if you waste it in front of the chef who spent 3 days and nights making it. The blonde chef growled out in anger, still holding up the half-conscious marine without any trouble. "Someone, stop Sanji before he causes any more trouble." One of the chefs called out in alarm. "Sanji? What are you doing to the marine lieutenant?" One of the chefs shouted. "Oh, it's just you shitheads." Sanji said in annoyance, dropping Fullbody from his grip. "Sanji, you know you're supposed to treat the customers like kings." Patty shouted. Patty had on a short-sleeved navy blue shirt with matching shorts that went down to his knees. Patty had a white rope tied around his bald head, a black beard, and a white apron tied around his waist. "You're just saying that because they eat your shitty food," Sanji said, lighting another cigarette. When Patty was going to retort, a man with a tall chef's hat, a long braided mustache, and a peg leg came down the spiral staircase that was in the center of the restaurant. "What's all the ruckus down here?" the man asked. "Head chef. Chef's F. You gotta stop Sanji. He's going on another rampage." A chef with brown hair, an unshaven face and sunglasses with a chef hat atop his head exclaimed. The mustached chef, now known as F, turned his gaze over to where Sanji stood. "Are you planning on starting a goddamn rampage in here?" Zeph said with an annoyed tone. "Put a cork in it, old man." Sanji said without missing a beat. "Who do you think you are to order me around? You trying to sink my restaurant, you punk?" Zeph exclaimed, giving Sanji a hard peg-legged kick to his face. Fullbody looked elated at Sanji getting a beating, but his smugful expression was wiped off of his face when Zeph turned his glare onto him. "You too?" Zeph roared, giving the lieutenant a hard kick in the head with his peg leg. "Get the hell out of my restaurant. Everyone in this place is insane." Fullbody muttered to himself, rubbing his jaw. "I'll get this place shut down, you hear me?" The Marine lieutenant shouted in an outrage when the front doors were slammed open and a soldier was standing there panting and looking like he saw Satan himself. "Lieutenant, sir. We have a problem." The Marine exclaimed in a panicked tone. "What is it?" Fullbody asked in an annoyed tone. "The Krieg pirate we caught escaped," and the soldier's report was interrupted as a gunshot ripped through the air and a bullet tore through his chest, sending blood onto the ground in front of him, and he fell to the ground dead, revealing a sickly man standing and holding a smoking gun with a ferocious glare frozen into his eyes. The deathly tense silence that followed was interrupted by the slow steps of the sickly man, who sat down at the nearest open table. "Get me some food, I don't care if it's table scraps, I'll eat it," the man said. "I'll take care of this," Patty said, walking to the table with a fake grin plastered on his face. "What can I get you, you filthy thief?" The tan chef said in a voice filled with fake cheerfulness. Like I said, I want some food. The man said gruffly. And how would you be paying for your meal? Paddy asked with the same fake cheerful tone. The man pressed the gun in his hand to Paddy's head. Is a bullet sufficient payment? He growled out. Paddy's face and mood darkened immediately at the threat. So you ain't got any money? Paddy asked dangerously. Faster than the man could realize, Paddy locked his fingers together, raised his arms up, and brought his large forearms down on him, destroying the chair below him and eliciting gasps of amazement from the customers. Listen, bum, this restaurant serves only paying customers. No one except Luffy noticed Sanji's scowl and slight anger and Zeph's frown in disappointment. When the man's stomach growled in obvious hunger, Paddy looked mockingly down at him. It seems you're really hungry, pirate. Paddy said mockingly. It's just gas, asshole. The starving man grunted back. Suit yourself. Paddy taunted, grabbing him and throwing him out the door. Paddy dusted his hands and bowed to the customers who were cheering at Paddy's show of strength. Luffy didn't bother pay attention as he saw Sanji slip out of the restaurant with a tray of food without anyone noticing. Wonder what that's about. He thought to himself, putting his cup down and walking after Sanji. When he walked out of the door, Luffy saw he was a level above Sanji, who placed a tray of fried rice in front of the starving man. Go on, eat up. The blonde chef said with a soft yet stern tone. I thought you didn't serve people without money. The man said with a bitter tone, even with his stomach groaning loudly in protest. To me, anyone who's hungry is a customer, now eat. Sanji said firmly. After a few moments of deliberation, the man dove into the meal, shoveling fried rice into his mouth as fast as he could with the one fork he had. This is the best food I've eaten in my life. He said with tears of joy pouring down his face and his voice choked up with emotion. Luffy watched the scene silently with a smile on his face. I like you, chef. Luffy said from his spot, causing Sanji and the now fed man to look up. I remember you, what do you want? Sanji asked curiously to the white-haired man in front of him. I want you in my crew. Luffy said bluntly. What are you, a pirate? Either way, I can't join, I've gotta work something off. Sanji said. I see. What do you have to work off though? Luffy asked, suddenly standing next to Sanji. It's none of your business what I've got to work off. Sanji retorted. Well, it's too bad for you that I'm not leaving till I get a chef for my pirate crew. Luffy said, putting his straw hat on his head in a terrible attempt at hiding his shit-eating grin. You're seriously a pirate? Why? The man asked from his spot at the railing next to Sanji. To become the king of the pirates. Luffy said looking straight at the man with confidence shining in his eyes. His face balked in shock with Sanji's at Luffy's declaration. You serious? Damn straight. I'm gonna go through the Grand Line and find One Piece. Luffy said with a grin. No. You can't go to the Grand Line. That place is called the Pirates' Graveyard. The man exclaimed with fear in his eyes. Really? I call it paradise. Luffy said. That place is a nightmare, my captain's fleet of 50 ships was demolished in a week by a single man. He shouted in fear. What's your name? Luffy asked curiously after a moment. My name's Jin. Jin answered, calming down. I'm gonna be honest and say that your captain must be a moron if he didn't even last a week in paradise. Luffy said bluntly. It wasn't my captain's fault we got demolished, we didn't have any knowledge of the Grand Line at all. Jin shouted angrily. Then the whole armada, I guess, was made up of complete morons. Luffy said, unfazed at Jin's show of anger. Sanji, so this is where you've been. A voice called from the upper deck. What do you want, shitty geezer? Sanji asked rudely. Just telling you to finish up and get back to work, brat. Zeph replied, walking back into the restaurant. Well, Jin looks like you've gotta head out, you can take one of the boats here. Sanji said with a smile on his face, motioning to one of the docked rafts. Thank you, Sanji-san, if it wasn't for you I surely would have died. Jin said with a smile on his face, seemingly forgetting all of his previous anger and getting in the raft, pushing off from the ship. It's no problem, Jin, stay safe. Sanji said with his own smile as he waved to Jin. Luffy smiled to himself, knocking his hat to hang on his neck. I really did choose a great chef. He muttered to himself, walking into Baratie to sit with his crew. Time skip. It's been a few days since the Sub-Zero Strawhat pirates arrived at Baratie and somehow managed to not spend a single beery thanks to Nami's persuading of Sanji, allowing her to order all she wanted off of the menu and not pay anything. The crew was sitting at the table they've used for the last few days when Zoro asked what they were all wondering. How much longer are we gonna stay here, Luffy? He asked in an annoyed tone. We're leaving when we managed to get Sanji onto the crew. Luffy answered from behind his wine glass. As he was going to take a sip, Luffy felt numerous strangely weak presences approaching the Baratie. Turning his gaze to the front door, he put down his glass and discreetly trailed his hand to his sword that rested at his hip. The fight's gonna happen. Not now, but eventually. Luffy warned his crew, still keeping his eyes on the front door. Zoro just grunted in affirmative while Usopp, Yasaku and Johnny tensed up at the thought of a fight. Luffy trailed his eyes around the table and noticed that their orange-haired navigator wasn't present. "Where's Nami?" Luffy asked curiously. "I think she stayed on the ship to watch after it." Yasaku answered with a thoughtful expression. Before Luffy's thought could dwell on it any longer, the doors slammed open, revealing two figures, one of which was Jin helping a large man who clutched one of his sides with his hand and the other arm slung over Jin's shoulders. "Please give me food, I've got tons of money, I can pay. So please, get me some food, I don't care if they're table scraps, I'll eat 'em." The large man begged as he was gently lowered to the ground by Jin. "Don't feed him anything." "That's Don Krieg." Patty shouted as it glared distrustfully at the kneeling pirate. Hearing the name, the customers went hysterical as most rushed out of the restaurant for their lives. As the cooks denied getting Krieg any food, Luffy tuned out the whole thing and stretched his haki out as far as possible, trying to sense the more powerful aura from a few days before. When he sensed it, he realized who exactly it was. "You've chased down your prey, eh, Hawkeyes?" Luffy thought with a smirk on his face, not noticing Zoro cast a curious-eyed long glance at him. "Everyone who values their lives, leave this ship now." Krieg's voice boomed. He was now standing on his own 2 feet, looking like he was never at death's doorstep a few minutes ago. All of the remaining customers, except Luffy and his crew, of course, ran out of the restaurant like bats out of hell. "Someone get me enough food for 100 men, my ship has my starving crew in need of sustenance." Krieg demanded with an arrogant smirk on his face. All of the cooks were denying the pirate the food he demanded, but stopped in shocked silence as Zeph dropped a large bag in front of the golden armored man. "Chef Zeph. What are you doing?" "Now he's going to attack the ship." At the name Zeph, Krieg's eyes widened in shock. "You're Zeph, red-leg Zeph. A man whose name originated from the blood of his enemies that coated his legs. Your kicks broke bedrock and left footprints on steel." Krieg explained before he looked at Zeph's peg leg and smirked. "I guess that name's useless now that you're a defenseless old man who can only cook." Luffy's eyes narrowed in annoyance at Krieg's attitude. From what he could tell, Zeph could hold his own, even with that peg leg. Luffy slightly shivered at the thought of taking a full hit from the old man's peg leg. "What's the point of this rant of yours, ingrate? As long I've got my own 2 hands, I can still cook, that's all that matters." Zeph said, slightly flexing his hands. "Now what do you want from me, brat?" Zeph asked fearlessly. "I know you have a guidebook from when you went to the Grand Line and came back alive, so give it to me, old man." Krieg demanded, ignoring the ingrate comment. "No." Zeph flatly denied. "With your logbook, I'd have the information I lacked when I first went to the Grand Line, and with that I'll become the king and conquer the Grand Line." Zeph declared. "Well, I'd hate to burst your bubble," Luffy said in a sarcastic tone. "But, I'm gonna become the pirate king, not you," Luffy said with a smirk on his face. "This isn't a game, brat." Krieg ground out in annoyance. "Oh no, I know it's not a game. I'm just stating pure fact. I'm gonna conquer the Grand Line and become king of the pirates," Luffy said in a matter-of-fact tone. "I don't have time for this, by the time I get back this ship better be cleared out or you're all dead." Krieg threatened, heaving the large sack of food over his shoulder and marching over to his ship, leaving behind a shaking Jin. "Sanji, I never meant for this to happen, I'm so sorry," Jin whispered in a broken tone. "It's alright, Jin, you didn't know this would happen," Sonny said in a soft tone. But still Jin's statement was cut off, a bit literally, in fact, when the broken down galleon Krieg and his crew showed up and was split down the middle, scaring Jin into place. "He couldn't have followed us from the Grand Line, he couldn't have," he muttered in near hysteria. "What is it?" Sanji asked, shocked. "He's arrived to take out his prey." Luffy spoke up, gathering everyone's attention to him. "Dracula Hawkeye's Mech. The world's greatest swordsman," Luffy said with a smirk on his face. Zoro's eyes widened in shock as his hand shot to his sword's handle, and he grinned in excitement. As everyone turned their attention outside, they saw a man sitting on a large coffin-shaped raft that had 4 candles burning with an eerie green light, with one leg crossed over the other and his hands resting on his knee, fingers interlocked. He had a black hat on his head with a white plume feather sticking out of it, a long black open coat with no shirt underneath, a gold cross necklace hanging around his neck on a chain, and a large cross that was on his back that was his blade so powerful that even Luffy could feel it. When he looked up, everyone's attention was drawn directly to his cold, yellow eyes, resembling that of a hawk's. As Luffy walked to the front door, he dropped his disguise, letting his hair turn back into his raven black color, and his eyes returned to their onyx color. "That psycho followed us all the way back. Is he here to finish the job? That guy destroyed 50 ships all by himself." Karn muttered to himself in shock. "Wait, I don't see any special weapon on him though." "That there on his back is his weapon," Zeph said with a matter-of-fact tone. "What? There's no way that's possible," Karn exclaimed in disbelief. "You bastard. Would you follow us out here?" one of the Creek pirates shouted out. Without sparing a single glance at the pirate when he answered. Just killing time. He answered shortly, his eyes dropping onto Luffy, he blinked in what seemed like surprise. Luffy-kun, so you're here, huh? Mihawk asked curiously with a small smirk on his face as he seemingly forgot about the pirates around him. Yeah, Hawkeye, but really, are you so bored that you need to chase some weak small fry back to the East Blue? Luffy asked with a raised eyebrow. Don't fucking joke with me. A pirate shouted, angered at being ignored, pulling out his 2 pistols and firing them both straight at the swordsman. With a grace that impressed Zoro, Mihawk drew his black blade and diverted the bullets away from him with ease before sheathing his sword again. What I missed? The pirate stuttered godsmacked as he looked at his pistols with a surprised expression. You're as perceptive as ever, Luffy-kun. Mihawk said casually as though he wasn't just shot at. You're right, though, I didn't only come to the East Blue just to finish off some prey. Mihawk said as he stood from his seat. I actually wanted to have a quick spar with you, Luffy, to see how you've grown from the last time we met. He said, causing Luffy's eyes to widen slightly in surprise. By now, everyone had shocked expressions on their faces at the display of causality between the two men. So, Luffy, Mihawk said seriously, walking to the edge of his raft. Do you accept my challenge between swordsmen? Mihawk asked challengingly. Will you fight me, Monkey D. Luffy? Smirking in excitement, Luffy jumped down to a floating piece of wreckage near the Baratie Mihawk meeting in front of him. You know I never turn down a challenge, Mihawk. Luffy said as he drew his sword and froze a second one in his left hand. But know that I won't hold back. Luffy exclaimed, pointing Fubuki-Rick at Mihawk as he drew his own black blade. The numerous bystanders stood gobsmacked and in fear of the impending fight between the two powerhouses. The world's greatest swordsman, one of the royal Shichibukai, Dracula Hawkeye's Mihawk, and the super rookie pirate with a bounty of 60 million bears, Monkey D. Luffy. No one there would ever forget this fight for years to come. Chapter 10. Wordlessly, Luffy and Mihawk charged at each other in a grand burst of speed, kicking up small dust trails in their wake, and clashed in the center with an ear-piercing shockwave and extreme gale of wind that was exuded from the collision, blowing back some of the weaker chefs, leaving only Sanji and Zeph standing with Luffy's crew with them with only Zoro standing. Both swordsmen jumped back, only to dash back at each other when their feet touched the ground, clashing once again and meeting in a flurry of rapid slashes and a whirlwind of power and strength. Meanwhile, Zoro's eyes were as wide as possible with sweat dripping down his forehead. So this he thought as the two powerful swordsmen clashed again, their blades meeting each other in a flurry of parries and cuts, haki flowing through their respective swords, is the strength of the world's greatest. Zoro thought as new determination entered his eyes. I will get stronger. He exclaimed in his head with determination. Mihawk and Luffy continued to clash swords, sparks continuously flying from the clashing steel as they clashed again and again in black blurs as their swords sang in excitement. For a quick moment, Luffy and Mihawk jumped apart from each other, both with slightly labored breathing and small cuts littering both of their bodies, Luffy having at least 2 times more cuts littering him than Mihawk, his suit having blood soaking through it. You certainly have gotten stronger, Luffy-kun. Mihawk said with respect in his voice. So have you, Mihawk. Luffy said casually as he froze a second sheath on his opposite hip. I'm putting everything I can into this attack, prepare yourself, Mihawk. Luffy said as he sheathed his swords and crouched into a stance. Very well. Mihawk said holding his sword behind with both hands. Itoru Hie. Luffy said as he and Mihawk dashed at each other, both of them clashing at the center for the briefest of seconds and dashing past each other, stopping a few meters away from each other. Rasenjiri. Luffy said as he slowly sheathed his swords. With a snap, Luffy's swords fell into their respective sheaths, his artificial sword dissipating into mist as the wooden rubble behind him had a deep helix-shaped gash that caused the wood to splinter and shatter. Luffy collapsed onto one knee and began gasping as a large gash cut its way from his left shoulder and down to his right hip. His crew stood with wide fearful eyes as they stared on at the scene with gaping mouths. But they were less worried about Luffy's cut. They were more worried about his missing arm. Blood was pouring down from Luffy's arm stump as his limb lay motionless next to him. Luffy bro. A collective worried shout sounded out from Usopp, Kaya, Johnny and Yasaku as Zoro's eyes were as wide as dinner plates. Not even Luffy could beat Mihawk. Am I that far behind the world? He thought in shock. Spitting out a mouthful of blood, Luffy let out a humorless chuckle. This is a bit excessive, isn't it, Mihawk? Luffy asked as he stood and faced Mihawk. You are indeed very strong, Luffy, and as you know I'm also somewhat reckless with holding back my strength. Mihawk said as he put his sword on his back as blood trailed from multiple cuts that peppered his body. But knowing your abilities, you should be able to make yourself a new arm, shouldn't you? Mihawk asked curiously. Luffy? Are you alright? Kaya asked worriedly as she, Usopp, and Johnny and Yasaku ran to his side, Zoro following behind them at a walking pace. Yeah, I'm fine, it's just an arm. I would have lost it sooner or later. Luffy said, shrugging her worries off. We need to find someone to sew your arm back on. Kaya said. It's probably no use, we're at a floating restaurant and I'm pretty sure that they don't have an on-call surgeon. Luffy said carelessly, causing Kaya to frown at him in annoyance. You have to get it sewn back on. Kaya said with a scolding tone. So you're all Luffy-kun's crew? Mihawk asked curiously. Yeah, why do you want to know? Usopp asked back. Just curious. Mihawk said as his eyes then fell on Zoro. Are you with Luffy as well? Zoro blinked in surprise as he just nodded in confirmation. What is your name? Mihawk asked, his hawk-like eyes studying Zoro. Arano is Zoro. The green-haired swordsman replied. After a few moments of seemingly studying him, Mihawk turned and began walking back to his boat. You and Luffy will make a great team, I'll see you at the top. Both of you. He said as he sat down and began floating away. Hey, hawk eyes. Krieg shouted from his ship. Shit, almost forgot about him. Luffy muttered with a frown, causing his crew to look at him, only to balk in shock. Luffy had created a prosthetic arm out of ice in the time that Mihawk was talking to them and was now clenching and unclenching the frozen fist. Looking around, Luffy had noticed the absence of a certain ship. Where's Mary? Luffy asked curiously. Nami was looking aft. Usopp said before his eyes widened. Shit. Nami must have stolen it. He exclaimed in panic. Didn't you follow me and my crew all the way here to kill me? Don Krieg, ruler of the East Blue Krieg shouted, breaking Usopp's panic in his arrogant tone, even as his crew begged him to not provoke Hawkeye. I followed you because I was bored, now I'm not, so I'm heading home to rest. Mihawk said without acknowledging Krieg. Krieg grinned down at Mihawk. I don't care if you're finished, I'm not done with you yet. Krieg said as he cracked his neck and brought out his cannon. As he was going to fire the cannon, Luffy felt a powerful presence appear in the area and he was sure Mihawk felt it as well, seeing as he and his eerie casket boat vanished, confusing and scaring multiple bystanders. You four get out of here, things are going to get dangerous here. Luffy ordered in a serious tone. Are you sure, Luffy? Kaya asked worriedly as she looked at Luffy's bloodstained suit. Yes I am, now go follow that dot, I'm guessing that's the going Mary, follow it to where it is going. Luffy ordered. Oh, and take this transponder snail, I'll contact it when I recover. Luffy said, putting a small snail into Kaya's hand. Go. He exclaimed, kicking his crew into gear. As Krieg was going to fire his cannon, a frozen trident flew out of nowhere and speared him in the chest, then dissipating to mist, leaving a gaping hole in his chest. Captain Krieg. You're all very unlucky to be here, you know. A lazy voice said from the farthest piece of rubble. Looking at the voice, Luffy's eyes widened and his body tensed at seeing the figure. An admiral already? The man that spoke was wearing a purple dress shirt with a yellow tie and matching white vest and pants with a sleep mask on his forehead. I am Admiral Aokiji of Marine HQ, but I guess that doesn't matter. Anyway, Monkey D. Luffy, I'm on orders to come and see how much of a threat you are. Aokiji said as Luffy glared at him. The two men stared each other down as Aokiji took notice of Luffy's wound and ice arm, but shrugged it off. Making the first move, Luffy dashed ahead and threw his fist at Aokiji, imbuing Haki into it as he punched forward, his fist crashing into Aokiji's open palm that shot him back to the deck on Baratie as he landed in a kneel with blood trailing from the corner of his mouth. Yuzushoku, huh? Luffy thought, standing and putting Haki into both of his fists. This kid just fought and lost his arm to Hawkeyes, now he's up against an admiral. The incredulous question came from Sanji as he looked on with a large amount of surprise and shock on his face. I'm Key Luffy, I may owe a debt to your grandfather, but orders are orders. So you're either going to have to die here or somehow escape. Aokiji said with a lazy tone. I know I can't beat him, especially without knowing his devil fruit and being in this condition. But still, I need to hold him off so that I can go on without worrying about my crew too much. Luffy thought seriously. How about I take option 3? The one where I fight you? Luffy asked with a smirk. Not wise, but you're just as reckless as your grandpa, it's almost nostalgic. Aokiji said casually. We're not here to talk about my grandpa. Luffy said as he placed his hand in the water. Ice Age. Luffy said, freezing a wide expanse of the ocean in seconds. Let's get started. Luffy said with a smirk. Sword. Luffy muttered, disappearing from sight and dashing at Aokiji and throwing a frozen Haki-imbued punch at Aokiji. Throwing his own fist out, Aokiji met Luffy's punch with his own, eliciting a shockwave from the point of contact that cracked and cratered the frozen ground beneath them. Jumping back to get some room, Luffy landed in a crouch as more blood spilled from his wound and held his hand in front of him, his arm bent at the elbow, his fingers pointing towards Aokiji. Nketsuya. Luffy said as dozens of arrows froze into existence behind him. Izukatachi. Aokiji said, holding his arm in a slightly identical way to how Luffy is. Irenda. Luffy exclaimed as he straightened his arm out, the arrows shooting forward at extremely high speeds at Aokiji. Peasant beak Akiji exclaimed as a large bird made of water shot forward at the same speed of Luffy's arrows. What shocked Luffy was the fact that his arrows were melted and evaporated by Akiji's bird. He's boiling the water. Luffy thought in realization. Shooting a spear of ice out of his hand, Luffy chilled his ice to almost -200 Celsius. That froze Akiji's bird in just seconds and caused it to shatter due to the thermal shock. That's impressive. Akiji said with his always lazy tone that hid a hint of impression. Luffy didn't respond, for he was on his knees with his frozen hand to his mouth as he coughed out blood. That put a lot of stress on me to chill it that much in such a short amount of time. Luffy thought as he took deep breaths, trying to regain his breath. Already at the end of your rope? I guess that's understandable, seeing your current state right now. But, if you're this strong even with all of those injuries, I can tell you'd be even more of a threat at full power, so I'll be leaving now, seeing as I've got my proof of your threat level now. Akiji said as he turned and began walking to the ocean and didn't stop, but actually melded with the ocean water and disappeared. The water loja, huh? Interesting. Luffy thought as he felt his world starting to fade to black. I lost too much blood. He thought as he started to sway from left to right. The least they could do is catch me. He thought tiredly as his vision finally faded to black. Let me know in the comments below if you guys want the next part. Also check out my other video that has been shown in left. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video please like and share this video. And have a fantastic day. Bye.